Great. Hello, and thank you for joining us today for the second day of the very first PrivacyNama conference. Today, we intend to focus on operationalization of data protection. And we're very, very pleased that we have an exceptional panel of practitioners covering three themes for today. Firstly, we have with us three people who've served as data protection commissioners who will speak to us about how data protection regulation is operationalized, what kind of capacity is required, what are the roles that a data protection commissioner is expected to play, what makes their job easier, what can make their job easier, and how do they deal with citizens' rights and also as representatives of an organization in terms of actually operationalizing a regulation. Second, we'll have a session on how negotiations take place at a global level about data transfers between countries. What are the sticky points? How are they resolved? What solutions exist for addressing differences in laws? And lastly, from a chief privacy officer perspective, we're going to discuss what kind of skills and tools and tactics and political negotiations do chief privacy officers need in order to reshape their organizations to deal with data protection laws. What advice do they have for future chief privacy officers or companies that are looking to hire for that role in terms of dealing with data protection regulations and aligning their companies towards operationalizing data protection. But before we begin, there are many people who made this conference possible. I'd like to thank Flipkart, the Internet Society, Facebook, Mozilla, the Mobile Premier League, Omidyar Network, Paytm, Star, and Xiaomi for the support. We are thankful to our community partners, the Cyber BRICS project, the Center for Internet and Society, and the Center for Communications Governance at the National Law University, Delhi, for their help in putting together this program. I'd also like to thank Paroma Bhatt from Process, Jalak Kakkar from CCG at NLU Delhi, Rajneesh Singh from ISOC, Rohit and Deepro from the Quantum Hub, Kailash Karthikeyan from Jaswal Consulting, Anya Kovacs from the Internet Democracy Project, and Luca Belli from CyberBRICS for all of their support. We put this discussion together in super quick time, and it wouldn't have been possible with all the help that we received. I'd like to invite the first panel to join us. And by way of introduction, I'd like to introduce Marek Hansen from Germany. Since 2015, Marek is a state data protection commissioner for land Schleswig-Holstein in Germany. I hope I pronounced that correctly, Marek. And the chief of the ULD. Before being appointed the data protection commissioner, she was the deputy commissioner for 7 years. Within the ULD, she has established Privacy Technology Projects Division and the Innovation Center Privacy and Security. Marek's focus is on data protection by design and data protection by default from both a technical and legal perspectives. So we look forward to hearing about actually making that happen in a state. Commissioner Raymond Liboro of the Philippines joins us. He was appointed the country's first privacy commissioner in 2016. He has fast-tracked data protection policy development in a country with the issuance of the Data Privacy Act's implementation rules and also significant policy circulars within the very first year of the NPC's establishment. So we have a lot to learn from him in terms of what to expect once privacy bills are enacted. Under his chairmanship, the Philippines has played a major global role. It became the first Asian country to be elected to the Global Privacy Assembly. And he's also chaired the first ASEAN Data Protection and Privacy Forum and became the host chair of the Asia Pacific Privacy Authorities Forum, or the APA. Importantly, he was chosen to lead and chair the GPA's COVID-19 task force last year and is currently the chair of the new working group. Teki Akutea Falconer from Ghana joins us. She was the first executive director of the Data Protection Commission in Ghana. And she also worked for the government of Ghana for the enactment of Ghana's Data Protection Act in 2012. She's currently an ICT and telecom lawyer, a privacy and data protection consultant. and a senior partner at a law firm based in Accra, in Ghana. She's also the founder and the executive director of the Africa Digital Rights Hub, a member of the UN Pulse and Privacy Advisory Group, and a non-resident fellow for the Center for Global Development. Malvika Raghavan, who many of you have probably heard at our discussions in the past, will be chairing this session. She founded and led the work of the Future of Finance initiative at Dwara Research in India until last year, and did some of the most important research on privacy in the country. She's currently undertaking doctoral research at the London School of Economics in Information Systems and Law, and remains an advisor to the Future of Finance's Initiative's International Advisory Board, and also serves on the steering committee of the Digital Identity Research Institute at the Indian School of Business and the Data Governance Network at the IDFC Institute in India. Malvika, over to you.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Nikhil, for bringing together this wonderful set of experts. I think I can't underscore what an exciting time it is from the Indian perspective for this discussion, because as many people in the audience will know, we've all been in these discussions before. MediaNama is a great platform. I think all of the names that Nikhil read out in the first 30 seconds shows you what a kind of convening house they've become for these discussions over the last sort of 3 or 4 years, at least, since we've had the consultation process around our Data Protection Act. I mean, for those of you following this, you know, there has been just a dramatic shift, and what I see as a win in our own consultation process, because many of you will remember that in the original proposals in 2017, there was a policy preference stated for light touch co-regulation without an independent central authority. And that all changed in 2018 when we got our first draft of the bill. And I think what's more interesting is over the 2 iterations of the draft, now that we have, you know, an independent authority, we've seen significant changes to its design and its powers over those 2 drafts, including how its board is selected, how its powers are constituted, and also the space that it leaves to imagination for accountability. So these are all some of the topics that I'm really hoping to discuss with. You know, I couldn't have asked for a better selection of, wisdom in this room, in this virtual room. I think our goal in this panel is to really look at the operational aspects of data regulation. So take it from this substantive, theoretical thing to, you know, really the experiences of being in the trenches, I think, of data protection. And for this, as Nikhil said, I think Commissioner Liboro, with your experience, I think as the first data protection commissioner in our Asian neighborhood, I think it's uniquely relevant. And I think you share that kind of honor, but also probably the agony and ecstasy with Teki Ekwete Falconer, who was the first executive director of Ghana's Data Protection Commission. And I think it's very interesting to kind of tie that into the kind of 3 generations of data protection law in Germany that Marek has exposure to. But I think specifically what would be great is, I think what's fantastic about Marek Hansen's training is that she brings the computer science and the legal aspects together. I think one thing we do know now in India is that building technologies themselves have to be studied and understood from a privacy and data protection lens. And I think we are all quite keen for it not to become an after the fact post-mortem exercise, right? How can we be the doctors in the room, and how can we do prevention rather than cure? So with no further ado, I'm going to sort of just invite the panel to make some opening comments. I think what I've asked them to do is just, you know, sort of 2 or 3 minutes of their top 5 or their top 3 recommendations or advice for a new regulator, if there is such a thing. And perhaps we can begin with Commissioner Liboro, move over to Teki Falconer, and then move over to Marek Hansen. And of course, I can come in and kind of moderate that discussion. But over to you, Commissioner Liboro, and thank you for joining us.
Thank you, Malvika. Thank you, Nikhil. My first thought is this: how I hope that we had sessions like this when we were starting our own data privacy journey, Marek and Teki, because really some of the jurisdictions are just coming into the game quite late or later than others. But let me tell you, there are huge benefits to this, Malvika and Nikhil. We learn, right? We learn from the lessons, from the knowledge that was generated by first generation privacy practitioner. Marek, I will not mention you to be first or second. I don't want to be accused of ascribing a generation to each. But But really, this is one huge privacy global community that is growing by the day. I think that's the biggest reality here. And that it is a community, this is a fraternity of jurisdictions and advocates, all right, that have risen above their own national interests to look into it. It's a global movement. So we are India, we are again anticipating and closely expecting that more and more of our jurisdictions, including India and other jurisdictions, will really come together now and join this global movement. So having said that, the Philippines, let me just make a brief introduction. Of course, our law was passed in 2012, but it's only in 2016 that when we were organized. And there's no particular playbook in organizing a data protection authority. But what I can tell you, for starters, is that very simple. As an authority, you have to assert your leadership, meaning so many of your constituents are looking to you for leadership and clarity. So really, I think the aim always of the DPA is to provide clarity. And that includes now, again, breaking down these concepts from really theoretical concepts into something that they can see some benefit from. So in the case of the Philippines, we just keep our messaging simple. We took a risk management approach in this. We recognize that privacy is a right, yes, but it is actually a risk for data subjects, for our citizens. It's a risk for companies and the processors or data users. It's a risk, again, even for the DPA itself, right? So we have to looking from that perspective, what I can say is that risks and threats and harms, they can be prevented and mitigated. The key, I think, is to focus on building data privacy resilience. And that is the way to mitigate and prevent risks and threats. So just like a volcanic eruption, just like an earthquake or probably flooding, these are all risks, threats, and potential harms, but there are ways to prevent them from becoming disasters, right? So as DPA, the central aim is always how do we prevent privacy disasters from happening? And you do that by building privacy resilience from the ground up. Meaning, if you have privacy resilient citizens, if you have privacy resilient companies, then you would have you will build resilience in this sector. Privacy resilience is a privacy disaster that did not happen. That is what we do every day. We prevent and try to, we prevent disasters or privacy disasters from happening. Thank you for my opening statement.
Thank you so much. And on that very inspirational note, I will hand over to invite Ms. Teki Akwete-Falconer to make her opening comments.
Thank you, Malavika, and thank you to the organizers of this event. It's an extremely important conversation, and I lend my mouth also to Libero to say that I wish when I had started, I had a room full of people to share similar experiences they've had in a similar ecosystem with me. For me, I think that one of the key recommendations that I will make to operationalization is that beyond the passage of the laws, we need the right political buy-in, leadership buy-in. And by the political leadership buy-in, I'm not just talking about the executive leaders, but they are very important, and their voice is very important to putting in place a framework that actually helps operationalize the laws. And I'll talk a bit more about it. We also need the right institutional leadership. And this is very important for a new institution that is being set up. You actually need it to encompass the embodiment of the individuals that are going to actually push and drive for the institution, because nobody knows the institution, nobody knows about the institution, and having the right kind of people in the right places brings a lot of integrity and trust to the institution. So putting in place the right leadership, whether it is a combination of institutional heads that play a key role in the society. In our case, we had a very good driving chair that was a retired Supreme Court justice that was highly respected with a lot of knowledge around human rights issues. We had people like the government statistician sitting on our board, and it really gave a lot of credence to the organization that you're creating. And so one of the things that I would say is that the leadership of the institution and even how these people are appointed is extremely critical to creating the right operational framework for the institution. Another thing that I will not keep stressing, I've stressed on it on many platforms, is resources, resources, resources. It is very important. A lot of us come from environments where our governments are very quick to pass these laws, and invariably it's a lot easier, you know, to push for legislations to be passed. But then when we set up these institutions, one thing we find is that we do not resource them. And I always share this experience of how between the time we were appointed to the time that we finally had approval to hire permanent staff, it was we started our operation somewhere in 2012, okay? And it took us more than 3 years. We got our final approvals coming through in October to hire permanent staff. And this really affects, you know, a number of things. And the number of challenges that were around it right from day one was we did not have the adequate financial resources that we needed to equip the organization. Another of the challenges that you're going to face, and it's very important that at the beginning these issues are discussed, are the human resource capacity that was needed. I had a situation of being one of the few on the board that actually had been trained in information and security, information technology and information security laws. And so I had knowledge about data protection and its workings, but I wouldn't even call myself an expert. And I realized that as soon as I took the helm of affairs, we were lacking, you know, in the right kind of capacity, and the limitations came from a number of reasons. We did not even have the adequate resources to even hire people that had the knowledge and skill set to be able to help us. And so that is also one of the challenges. Putting in place the right resources is really going to help enable the organization. The other thing that I would say as a recommendation is that you have to be very strategic. And so what tends to be happening with a lot of data protection regulators are that we are in the party a little too late, right? So we're coming in when there is a lot happening around us. So you really have to build a strategy and prioritize the most important things, because otherwise you're then thrown into the maze and everybody is looking up to you as if, and at some point I remember feeling like I've been set up to fail, right? Because everybody is looking at you and all that. But in that state, it's important to then sit back and then prioritize what is going to be important, what are the next steps. And one thing that we should all be open to doing is learn from others. And that really helped us, because a number of people are out there that have walked the path. They may not have the same conditions. In our case, the ICO, Information Commissioner's Office of the UK, offered tremendous support to us, and we chose them predominantly because we had similar legal systems and structures. So you could actually see how, you know, implementation would work and all that. And we took a lot of learning from them and even tried to have some kind of exchange and they were very supportive. So you need to identify the right community and identify somebody that has done it well, and don't be afraid to learn from them. Last but not the least, it is an ecosystem that is run on a cooperation and collaboration, and that is very key. So you should not see yourself as an island, otherwise you're going to be lost. And I remember we very earlier on got Ghana to sign up to what is now the Global Privacy Assembly, and that really gave us a space and an opportunity to meet other people and to develop relationship even with other African countries that had data protection regulators as well. There is comfort in numbers, and in this space, it can be a very long and lonely space. I remember I was quite elated in our first meeting of the international conference in Mauritius, which was where Ghana was admitted, where I met the Mauritian DPA, who was almost as young as me, and she shared her own experiences, you know, because at some point I was feeling a bit lost as to, am I doing the right thing? Am I, you know, facing the right challenges? And it can be stressful. So finding like-minded people that have gone through similar experiences and sharing it with them, even on an informal level, helps. And the Global Privacy Assembly at the time, the Information Commissioners Conference, you know, really helped model, you know, the kind of DPA that we wanted. It was a ground for knowledge and capacity building as well, you know, so that really helps put you and the organization that you're building in perspective. So, you know, put it shortly, we need the political leadership, we need the right institutional leadership, we have to have the right resources put in the finances and in the human resource capacity, have a strategy, prioritize, and then make sure that you cooperate and collaborate as well as learn from others. So these will be my recommendations.
I'm so glad we have this YouTube link, hopefully afterwards. Maybe it can be one of the kind of induction procedure if and when we do get our data protection authority. I mean, I think so many important points there. I think especially this whole idea of how political data protection is right now. We're just recovering from the WhatsApp downtime. And in private sector in India, there's a huge debate currently around the role of social media intermediaries, for instance, in our society. And many of these are global debates. So I'd love to hear now from Marek Hansen, welcome you to this conversation, but also from your vantage point in the EU and also from a civil law system, which has a very different regional structure, something we had aspired to in India for a country of 1 billion people to have a central office, probably starting with 10 human beings, is not going to be easy. So your thoughts would be most welcome.
Yes, thank you very much. Thanks for the invitation. Thanks for the wise words from everybody who spoke before me. And I'm kind of the grandmother if we think of the legal basics on data protection law. It's more than 40 years old. And as a computer scientist, I know 40 years. These are several generations, not only 3 legal, I agree, but also even more what has happened since the 70s with technology, with data processing, with globalization, and with many, many problems that, well, still are growing and emerging. So one promise, if you engage in data protection, you will have interesting times. It will be very interesting. You can learn every day. You can influence a lot. So you have to look because everybody has different laws. What are your powers? When we started 40 years ago, or when I started in the mid of the 90s, there were not so many powers of data protection authorities. So they were rather a complaint handling body to de-escalate. People could complain and they will handle the complaints, or they do some nice investigations. So these times were not so high fines, there were not big compliance risks. And this has changed 2018 with the GDPR. And not only that the powers have improved a lot for data protection authorities, and which of course means you have to use your powers in a cautious way. Otherwise, you may be you may be in the center of shitstorms or in the center of legal proceedings because if you have much power, be cautious with them. But also because of the awareness of people. Sometimes because of they knew now or know better than before that they have data subject rights. In principle, the GDPR in Germany has not changed a lot on data subject rights, but almost nobody knew beforehand, although we were telling them, but who were the people listening to DPAs, if they didn't have a problem, a concrete problem, then they perhaps thought about they could approach us. But now, because of the media and the GDPR, everybody knew they have rights. They want the data protection authorities to help them. And also the companies, the organizations, they perhaps don't want to do everything in a perfect way, but at least be compliant. Don't risk big fines, don't risk reputation. And therefore you have to tell the stories, you have to be visible. You have to make sure that both the privacy disasters are understood and hopefully prevented, because privacy by disaster is kind of working. It's my job to prevent disasters. Still, if there are no disasters, it seems that people don't learn. And on the other hand, show also the solutions. And this is a little bit tricky, but we know that also from security and development, it's a process. It's something where we need a data protection management system, something where you reevaluate for each situation, whether you have to change something, you have to learning culture, mistakes, errors, how to handle that. And this is something where people very often only want to buy a solution, a product, and then everything is done and they've paid and now they are compliant. No, because the world is changing. And therefore, they have to change within the new surroundings. And this is also about risks. And I think, meanwhile, people learn that the world is not a static thing. It's not something in all areas. See the pandemics, for example. The research delivers new results, and we have to adapt. If we have this kind of thinking, then it's much easier to be also some organization or as a data protection authority to have fair processing and to do that. So make visible what is happening, make visible the risk, and then also make sure that there are solutions, that they present them and that people have the feeling they can do something and don't give up. And without visibility, it's much, much harder. And then choose wisely your cooperation partners. You will need them. There's so much stuff all over the place. On the other hand, some of the cooperation partners have a hidden agenda or not so hidden agenda, and that you should have you should take into account that not everybody is perhaps cooperating with you on a fair way. So I think this is my advice. But start and be motivated. Look into communities, meet people. Otherwise, perhaps you get frustrated, and then you cannot help anybody. So. It's an interesting field, and I think you can get most out of it, and you can change a bit the world.
Thank you so much for those opening comments. I mean, we've already learned a lot. I think we've covered a lot. We've given a hint of all the ground we're going to cover in the next 45 minutes. Thank you also to the speakers. All of you made such substantive comments, but we still have sort of 45 minutes left for our discussion. I think broadly what I'm proposing is that we divide it into two large chunks, right? I think we had so many questions, but I think the first big chunk that came up in all of your comments was really this idea of leadership and collaboration. And these are big words, which are very hard in practice. I've written many policy memorandums where you write intersectoral coordination, XYZ, and then you add some citations. But that process of building that leadership, I think maybe we spend 20 minutes on that. And then maybe the second half of the conversation on actually the tools of enforcement, this idea of how do you manage complaints? What is good enforcement like? I know that in Ghana, you have criminal sanctions. In India, for the first time, in the latest draft, criminal sanctions were introduced. And there is a concern that we don't even understand this thing, and could someone go to jail for it, you know? So it's a very difficult space, especially when you think about mens rea in criminal law. I think maybe we can go there a little bit and wind up the discussion right at the end. But to kick off, I think one thing that we are very curious in India now is this idea of institutional design. Specifically, much has changed in both the board composition of our proposed DPA, how many people will be on it, what their functions will be, and how they will be selected. They will all currently in the current model all be state representatives without independent directors, which was a change from the previous one. And also, I think, so one idea is, one thing I'm very curious to hear from your experience is how does that work with leadership, and where in Germany, for instance, it is completely independent. You don't even have a board. How does that, what are the risks and benefits, and how would you compose it if you had no constraints? And the other part of this is this idea of the funding model. So, taking theory to practice means it's like a startup. It's a startup regulator. And we were mentioning on the pre-call that our central bank is older than our country, so you have a lot of well-staffed, well-oiled regulators. And here you have a small sort of baby regulator coming in and taking turf in some sense. So I'd love your thoughts both on that institutional design and on the funding model, human resources question that you raised. And I'll invite all of you to jump in. I mean, happy to go in the order that we started, but otherwise, I mean, this order is purely practical.
Malavika, these are exciting times ahead for India and your DPA and your Data Protection Authority. We're about to implement a 21st century law that will build the 21st century regulator that will protect 21st century rights, but operating on a 19th century budget. That's a, that's the, and the budget will never be enough, Tika, right? So really, one of the biggest challenges for DPAs is, of course, that since I told you there's no actual blueprint, a playbook on how you can really spring up a DPA from scratch. But you really have to work with the resources available to you. And you have to maximize. The biggest challenge at the get-go is to maximize how to maximize results and maximize these resources to gain maximum results, right? And you keep things simple. And why am I saying that there are really exciting times ahead for India? Because we are now going to see privacy implementation and execution in hyperscale, right? And if you will imagine, you probably, it's a quizzical look from you, Maravika, but if you will look at the most populated countries in the world, I mean, I took a look at the Philippines, it's around the 13th in terms of population. And before the Philippines, there are actually two jurisdictions that I would say that have been ahead of the game quite earlier. You have Mexico and probably even the United States that had the FTC, or the Federal Trade Commission law, as early as 1906. So, but these are again jurisdictions with no comprehensive laws yet. India is about to implement its comprehensive law. China too is getting on board with their PIPL and their new personal information privacy law. And here in the ASEAN region, you have Thailand coming on board, Indonesia coming on board. These are now countries whose population is probably above 100 million, close to 100 million. So really, and you now have a regulator operating in this condition, right? And this is really one factor to consider. So when maximizing resources, you just have to think about three things. What does a 21st century regulator do? We promote rights, we protect rights. Can you still hear me?
Yes, yes.
And we build capacity to do the right things right.
I'm going to do something I will probably never be able to do in my own country and ask a commissioner, interrupt a commissioner.
Sure.
And ask you, sir, when I'm just to drill down on the specifics of this enforcement question, I suppose one thing we're thinking about is if you have to maximize resources, exactly like you said, and say there are only 10 people in the room, what would you say should be those 10 people? Is it a technologist, lawyer? I mean, I think we're trying to get a tangible sense of what is your idea of maximizing that resource in terms of the human constraints that we're working with in a capacity light environment?
All right, let me touch on 3 points here. All right, and from my own experience, data protection and privacy probably involve 3 general areas of knowledge, right? And this is about risk, this is about technology, and this is about the legal framework, right? So you have to have a good mix of, again, it's again the technical side, the IT. It's about risk. Probably you really have to have your economists on board too, and it's about legal. Right,
I threw in media, communication.
Well, that's again, but yeah, in that is one area. You're very correct, Maris. As I mentioned, the three things that we do as DPAs: we promote rights, and that's where Marit is. We have to be effective by doing that through media. We promote rights. And how do we promote rights? It's coming up with the right policies, coming up with the right advice, giving guidance, engaging and collaborating with our stakeholders, and setting standards and support. So it's PAIDS: policy, advice, information, dialogue, standards, and support. So that is how we promote rights. How do we protect rights? And this is where you put on your complaints hat. Because again, we are protecting 21st century rights. So what we did in the Philippines is that we came up the very first year with a very strong awareness campaign. And we knew if you suddenly wake up your population that they have 21st century rights, the next thing they will do, they will complain. And they will expect your data privacy authority to act on their complaint. Now, you have to use the time in building awareness, in building your own capacity to respond to complaints. Complaints will not happen overnight, Nikhil and Manita. It will gradually build up because people become more aware. So you use the time from now until that time that complaints started coming in to train, build capacity, your own personnel, and build, of course, the capacity now of, as I mentioned earlier, very important that we promote and build resilience on the firm level. That's why here in the Philippines, what we did was really promote the role of data protection officers. We understand that we will never have enough sufficient resources to enforce our law. So we need allies, we need deputies. So we had to deputize, and we did that. And Marines is already raising her hand. That is really, I think, a key here is that the authority, okay, lead the development and the building the capacity of companies through their data protection officer. Then now you have your allies and you have your deputies within companies that processes data to help you implement your law. Thank you.
Yes, if I may, I think the DPOs, the data protection officers, they are a great asset. And in Germany, we have a tradition that even small companies, so beginning from 20 employees, handling personal data, they have to have a data protection officer, not necessarily one full person, that could be also a service hired or so. And this data protection officer has to have the skills, in principle, all the skills again, on data protection, so also technology a bit. And so being able to, I think, acting as a first line of defense or to help within the company, but also be the first line of the first point of contact for their complaint. So usually people who have said complaints to us have complained already to the organization. Right. So we are not the proxy for them in general. There are some concepts all over the world and in the police sector where there should be some kind of proxy because people perhaps don't dare to complain or ask questions against the police or so. But on the other hand, here, the DPOs can they can de-escalate already. They can solve it internally. And the European model is a little bit, well, there's a higher boundary saying 250 people or high risk. High risk, I totally agree, but 250 is very much. And for us, so I'm very happy that we have a strong tradition on DPOs and they have their own networks. We are invited to go there. So otherwise, we cannot have a high standard in the full area.
Yeah, in Marits and Malavika, let me tell you, in the Philippines, we have 23,000 registered data protection officers. So we practically have guys in all those companies. And what we did, as you introduced me earlier, was immediately when we came up with our implementing rules and regulation, it's very important and in the first year that you also come up with your own procedures. And that includes complaints handling, ma'am. Yes, and our rule states that before you complain to the DPA, complain first with the DPO, complain first with the company. If you cannot resolve it that way, then it's the time to elevate it to your DPA. Now, this is again a prime example of how we can maximize results and how we can train or build capacity of force. We have force multipliers in the ground, right? with an army of data protection officers. So we now have organizations of data protection officers. We organize them into the different business sectors. We have the banking sector, the education sector. We have DPOs for the health sector. And they are now really more, now they're specializing because again, there are so many unique situations in each sector. So they themselves now are developing their own codes or practices within their sector.
Thank you. So I mean, that was fascinating, actually. So basically, if I can understand correctly, almost, leverage the private sector's enforcement capacity and almost, kind of force them to self-enforce so that you can reduce the stress on your own human capacity requirements. But I specifically wanted to bring Techie in on the other point, which is once you've solved or you have a strategy for solving the human resources problem, how do we deal with the human relationship problem? Specifically, I think between the board and authorities, but also externally with other regulators. I think one point that you all talked about was this idea of collaboration across regulators, maybe to deal with the capacity constraint. And Techie, I don't know if you have anything to share from your experience there.
Yes. And I think that I want to throw a bit more light to my experience as a startup from some of the comments that are coming in, because I had a slate that had nothing. There were no DPOs, and that is what you're going to have. So you're going to have to train and raise people that have the knowledge and capacity. And that's why awareness creation is one of the key things that you will have to do as a DPO. So a lot of resources must be put in, a lot of resources must be put in also building that ecosystem. But again, I agree that collaboration, even with your potential data controllers and processors, is key. And the role of the data protection supervisors or officers at that point becomes a very key role there. For us, we really leveraged. We did not have any resources at all. And so we had to even leverage on traditional media, and they become like our partners in disseminating and identifying public issues around data protection, and we always use those opportunities to further heighten awareness. I think in our quiet conversation, one of the biggest challenges you face as a data protection authority is that you now have to translate this technical legal law into a breathing and a document or a breathing and existing being that is actually identified by the people. And that's one of the strongest awareness that you're going to create for people to understand what these rights are, what their obligations are. They need to see the relevance of it to themselves. And you have to push in a lot of awareness in demystifying the subjects from the technical point of view to a more humane, a more human-centric environment where people can now personally identify with the data protection issues. That also helps with creation of more awareness and dissemination. And so one of the first things we really had to focus on for us was awareness and really demystifying this subject from a purely technical perspective to, a human perspective, where now when I'm talking to somebody about data protection, they actually know what it means to them. If it's an organization, it's also able to see what data protection means to its organization. And that actually spearheads, the awareness and helps push for a lot more of the dissemination beyond the resource constraints that you have as a regulator. On enforcement and collaboration, one of the things, and we had learned this in Ghana from other laws, whereby, you know, there are 2 institutions or 3 institutions that have similar roles. And so you would see that there are roles that sometimes we used to say it was conflicting, but there were roles that were similar to each other. And so it becomes a power play issue. And so we had learned in the development of legislations for the IT sector that one of the best ways of handling those power role issue and power play challenges around the leadership and institutional drive was to ensure that most of those critical institutions had leadership within the governing structure of the regulator. So for instance, our regulator had a key institutional roles. As I had mentioned earlier, we had the government statistician on our board. We had the communications regulator on our board. We had the ICT authority on our board. We had the central bank representative on our board. We even had ICT institutional reps, association reps on our board. And what that meant is that we were then able to, at the board level, create a system of buy-in from these critical sectors and institutional people to actually help push and disseminate the importance of the decisions that we had taken in the boardroom, which was then going to come out. What that then meant is that publicly you had less of a friction and institutional turf wars around it, because invariably they are part of us, and we're taking these decisions together at the boardroom. So they were able to play a key role, and that really helped to a large extent in collaboration as well. So I remember there were a number of challenges, for instance, with institutions in the financial sector. And when we started our registration exercise, I realized how the central bank played a key role. So people go to the central bank to apply for certain licenses, and they're like, where is your data protection registration certificate, right? So that really helped, because now they don't just see themselves as another regulatory authority. They see themselves as part of the institution, and we're all collaborating to facilitate, implementation. And that's one of the ways that you do away with the institutional friction and the challenges that come around there. And so most of these institutions, including the communications regulators, were extremely helpful, in building the kind of image that we wanted. Having said that, you will still see institutions that are outside of this structure, but you still need them on the board, and you still need their role, especially when it comes to enforcement. And I will touch on the biggest challenges that we had was because we did not have administrative powers of administrative sanctions, to issue administrative fines. So we could issue notices and all of that, but they were not as strong as administrative fines. And so I remember very earlier on when we were tinkering at the board level around how do we push for enforcement, there was that conversation around at the appropriate time, we need to bring this issue of giving the regulator power to issue administrative fines, because it cuts a lot of the bureaucratic bottlenecks around, criminal enforcement of the law. Because what criminal enforcement then meant for us was that, for instance, a lot of the laws, failure for not registering was a misdemeanor. And what that means is that it has to go to the lowest level court, which means that even the fines there were it wasn't really punitive, if I should say that. And I remember, I always give example of how there was a period, right, where we had started the criminal enforcement for non-registration. And we had one of the first court criminal fines being issued against a hotel in the country, but we couldn't make noise about it, because when they went to the court actually gave the lowest level of the fine, which was, I think at the time, maybe a little over $150 for non-registering. So it wasn't even punitive enough to, yes, we made the noise that, you know, they've been fined, they've been found criminally liable, which was good, but you couldn't talk about the fine. At the same time, in Europe and elsewhere, we were seeing institutions that were being held liable, you know, and it was, you could talk about the fines because they were punitive enough, you know. So those were some of the things, navigating the legal structures around enforcement. We had to, for instance, collaborate with the Attorney General's office, the police, to ensure enforcement. And remember, some of these things must be done in a timely manner. The first few prosecutions we were able to do took us close to 3 months, you know, or more to enforce. And these were like just 2 prosecutions. So that in itself, can you imagine if you have a list of non-complying organizations in their thousands, and we have them in their thousands, so that had not complied with the requirement to register. I do not even think the police had that capacity. At some point at the board level, we were toying with the idea of, and in fact, we had spoken to the judiciary that had created some special courts around IT and had allocated certain courts to address data protection issues. So the then Chief Justice was very helpful enough to give us a special court, which helped in a number of ways. Then the judges can be trained. But remember that you are prosecuting these cases at different levels of the court structure. So it technically means that you have to have a district level, you have to have a circuit level person trained, you have to have the high court, because the cases that go to the high court are very minimal. And they are not one of the ones you're pushing for, looking at even how the law was structured and, you know, the offenses were structured in the light of the law. So the criminal sanctions have always been a very, very difficult challenge to navigate and enforce. And that, in a way, actually undermines the effective operationalization of, you know, your enforcement strategies and all of that, because it's something that you cannot do as a DPA alone. We, at some point, the board had suggested, and we had started speaking to the Attorney General and a number of institutions, and had set up a unit within our organization that had a prosecutor and all of that. We had also requested to be made, given a special license to prosecute, for instance, our own cases, but you could only do special license for lower courts. You couldn't do it for the higher courts and the like, because of the legal constraints. So those things could actually affect, you know, your ability to effectively implement. Now, one of the things that actually worked effectively for us when it came to registration was the naming and shaming, you know, but even there, you have to be very strategic, because once you come out as a DPA, most, especially when you're handling, in our case, we had mandates over both government and public sector, both private and public sector. One of the biggest challenges that you face has to do with the fact that you need these institutions, right, to ensure everybody is looking at you, especially private sector, thinking most public institutions, especially in my country, regulators are not, you know, they are an albatross. I've seen a question in the question around, we've had this competition law passed and the institution is not doing anything. What makes you think that? So there's usually that sitting on the fence by everybody and looking at you to see whether or not you can enforce the law, because the enforcement of the laws is the catalyst to compliance, is the catalyst to making sure that people respect the laws. If they will dishonor or disrespect the laws and there are no consequences that flow from it, then the impunity will grow. Yeah. You know, so that was one of the biggest challenges that we had. And in order to deal with that, you really have to ensure that you bring on board all the government agencies. If you're doing a naming and shaming, you can't leave government agencies out. And I remember when we did our own, we had, and in fact, the first 10 of the list were all key public institutions that had failed to comply.
If I may, just jump in, because Chairman Neboro has to leave shortly, Malvik, if I may just take the liberty. I wanted to understand, if you had to adapt so the organization for scale for 1 billion people, what would you change? And in terms of, just the powers that a DPA must have, if you could outline some of those things that will give a DPA strength to be able to be effective in a country. Chairman Neboro?
Nikhil, all right. Thank you for that question. Really, the culture you are promoting, a new culture, if I may call it, a culture of privacy. But it's very important, and you want to promote that culture to the whole, promote it to the whole population. In your case, it's going to be 1 billion citizens, right? But it's very important too that the DPA develops its own culture. And here in the Philippines, I've tried to instill really, it's a culture or a bias for action and a bias for collaboration. And early on, and this is my just again a personal advice to the DPAs: put your customers in the center, front and center of everything that you do. You will never go astray. Always the rights of the data subjects, because you may. Companies may blame you, other governments, you will not get, they might not agree with you. But always, if the citizens discern and realize that the DPA is on their side, you will never go wrong. You will never go wrong. So it's a customer-centered approach. The bias for action and collaboration, because what you lack in resources, you just put it by hiring again of some very young and very idealistic staff with you that would really work long hours, but those who would really join you in the trenches. It's very important that the DPA develops a culture again of a 21st century regulator. We understand that we cannot prosecute everybody. In fact, our law, when it was approved in 2012, was considered the most punitive law in the region before. But, as a DPA, it's very important that you really come across that we are very judicious in doing that. In fact, I thought that I would not, as a metrics, it is not the number of people that we will jail. I won't be happy jailing too many people or even jailing them, because that means I failed. That means we failed in building resilience. No? That means we failed in promoting a culture of pride. That means we failed in impressing the companies that all of this is actually a competitive differentiator for them. So if they look at it now, that privacy is a corporate responsibility. That privacy again is a huge badge on their chest that they can, show their customers.
What are the powers that you wish that you want every DPA to have? Like, what are the powers that you think they should have?
Again, the powers should be myriad, because we are not a one-trick pony. So the power to lead, meaning the power to come up with policy, advice, information, and the power to set up standards. The power, and that's one hat that we wear. We wear it as a leader. And the second hat is that we are a complaints handler again.
Yes.
So the power to process complaints and come up with adjudicate it in a very judicious and fair manner. Right. The third is to power to and the third hat that we wear is a police officer. So definitely we have a stick too, right? So the power to enforce that and the power to authorize, the meaning that what are the standards that because they will be looking to you for standards, they will be looking to you for guidance.
Would you want to have powers to prosecute criminally?
Yes, that's again a huge power at your hands, of course. So Tika was already mentioning some of the that it's not it is not the magic wand, no, for instilling. Because let me just tell you this, no, when we now view companies, and I would tell companies this, right? There are only two types of companies now in my view. One is the compliant company and the non-compliant company, right? But I also realize that for a compliant company, there are still two types of compliant companies or non-compliant companies. Or let me begin by non-compliant companies. Those who are not complying because they don't understand this, or they have heard of the concept for the very first time. In your case, in India, that would be a very huge number, a very huge swath of your stakeholders who would probably have never heard about this, right? But they have no intention of violating the law. So you have to consider that. Now, there are those that non-compliant who are what? Really deliberately, willfully violating your law. You have to reserve your strongest powers in dealing with them. Those who are now complying, I realize, Mary, is there are still two types of companies. So those who are complying, those who are complying, what we call is paper compliance, right? That they have, they have a registered DPO, but they are not promoting privacy culture in their corporations, right? They're just waiting for the authority to catch them, no? So again, for those who say that they're complying, there are two types of complying companies, those who are paper compliant only. What we need to aspire for is to develop operationally compliant companies, right? So that is really what we want the companies that in that case, then we show them our leaders, we put our leader hat in dealing with these companies who want to operationally be compliant, who want to escape from paper compliance. So our doors as TPAs should always be open for these companies. So we provide them policies, give them good advice, set up a nice website with all the information is there. Even if you go to our website, and we just promote it, it's www.privacy.gov.ph. There are only three things that you can do in our website, right? You can know more about privacy, you can comply, and you can complain, right? So if you're a company, if you wish to comply, you go there, we will provide you all the information. Let me invite you, and of course, PrivacyNama, and you get whatever you want from there. I think we have a very good relationship with Ghana. Patricia before, Goku. Yes, before in Ghana. So I told them, get everything you want. We came up with our own, what we call the compliance formula, an accountability compliance formula. So we keep our messaging very simple for companies. Appoint a DPO, know your risk, right? Demonstrate your, come up with a plan, with a privacy plan. Number 4 is demonstrate your privacy through transparency notices, and 5th, be prepared for breach. So keep your concept simple, because the law itself is so difficult, right? But keep, again, focus on the customers, your companies, your customers, keep your messages simple to them and their instructions. And, naturally, they will go the way of compliance because you are paving the way and providing them an easier route to comply.
Thank you so much, Malvika.
Yeah, I mean, I think there are so many things we could unpick there. And I like that tripartite, no more comply and complain. Those as the 3 main areas, because I think when translating this to the public, there are so many powers we've talked about, and I think that's the hardest. I'm also aware, unfortunately, we're in the last 10 minutes of our discussion, but I wanted to pick up on this point of how do we help entities comply and how do we leverage, people within those entities and tie that in. And I'd invite Marek to begin this part of the discussion is really tied into what is the distinction between enforcing against a public entity, a public agency, and a private agency, because this is obviously, there are several substantive issues at play, but on the practical basis, I think this is quite an interesting one because if we step away from criminal sanctions, which we know have their constraints and problems. When you're looking at administrative sanctions, all the way from naming and shaming up unto fines, is there a distinction in the way that you have to handle your public agencies and your private agencies? And I invite Marek to begin and perhaps add something to the previous conversation if you had any, and then we could go around, because I'm very keen to hear again from Chairman Liboro and Teki about Commissioner Liboro and Teki in terms of our kind of more developing country context and new regulators as well.
Yes, thank you very much. So for us, the criminal question is a binary one. So if it's a criminal activity and there are some criminal provisions in the data protection law, then it's not our case. Then we hand it over to the criminal prosecutors. We are also, we have the power of reporting an offense, so writing a letter to the criminal prosecutors, and so we can start a case. But on the other hand, very often it's not a criminal activity as they investigate, and still they think it's an administrative misbehaving in the data protection law, and so we get back the files, or we get back files like video surveillance or some bugging of cars or so, where we can decide, or if they found the files in a shed and with health data, for example. So then we get back the cases, or we get them at the first time, and then it's our case. But it's not a real cooperation, it's more back and forth, and then it's always clear, and only one organization has the role of leading that. Our most important power, I think, is the administrative order to change something. The data processing has to be changed in order to be compliant, or the data subjects have to be notified because it's the law, or the files have to be deleted because there's no legal baseline for that, no fundament. So this is something where people, organizations really have to change something, and it's much more difficult usually for them than paying a fine. So I don't want to issue fines, and each year they pay 50 euros or 50,000 euros, and they put it already in their budget. That's also risk calculation, not the risk calculation I'd like to see, but some of them think, how likely is it that they are checked, that there's an investigation? How likely is it that there's a high fine? And then they can calculate, they perhaps even think about insuring themselves against the DPA. I don't like that. I want administrative powers for every DPA to say you have to change something. And of course, sometimes the DPA is wrong, or sometimes they didn't understand that there are other ways, and there should be something which is not as strong, so a warning, or seeing the word for the first time and must not repeat the case or so. But always we have then the power to say, you have to deactivate the video surveillance, or you have to use another angle, you have to do some blurring, for example, use this additional technology, you have to secure your data. And then we can, after a month or 2 or 3, check whether this has happened or not. But if they don't agree, because perhaps their business model is affected, perhaps it's really something very fundamental for this company, or something where a public service didn't behave according to law, then they will challenge. They will challenge our administrative order, and we will see each other before court. And this can take 1 or 2 years in the first instance. And this is a bad thing, because we have now cases that are perhaps even 10 years old, and still our administrative order from the day one has not been enforced. But at least it's in the legal system, and I think it's a fair thing that everybody knows the rights, and then it's a good thing. If we don't have that, and before the GDPR, we could only say it's wrong, or you should pay a small fine. This is not the right way to really change something. For the public service, we don't have fines in Germany. It's not throughout Europe the same, because they argue it's public money going to the public budget, so why should they pay a fine? It's more a reputation thing, of course. Usually if the state has to pay a fine, they also think about, perhaps this is now something where it's a liability. We don't want that. But so I'm not so sure whether this is a good decision. But again, we can have this kind of administrative order that it has to change. And also, the worst thing for us is if our letters of our administrative orders are ignored. Then we have a flaw in our law that we can be ignored by a public entity. And of course, then the naming and shaming would start, I guess, because then it's the last resort. We cannot do anything else. Otherwise, we don't do any naming and shaming if we see that really a change is happening. And for fines, very often I see my colleagues or ourselves, if we have in the public, in the private area, if we have a high fine, we usually discuss with them, what do you change? What will be, what have you learned, lessons learned? And some press release can say, yes, it was wrong, but they learned from that. And so even a fine can be something positive for a company if they have the feeling they can tell their story and it will never happen again. Our customers can trust us now, so that this is not a real naming and shaming, because everybody knows already for every wrongdoing they paid something and they learned from that.
I just received confirmation that we are at time, but we have 5 more minutes. And Nikhil, please come in whenever you need to drop us off. But I think that was fascinating, because I think at the end of this discussion, we've come to a point where we realize the limitations of both criminal sanctions and fines are often seen as the biggest tools in data protection's toolkit. And there again, I just wanted to invite again Chairman Liboro and Teki to come in. So in your context, it's quite interesting that, administrative orders are clearly the ones with most power to change action. So in your context, I would like to ask that again, Chairman Liboro and then Teki, but also specifically this idea of, do you find a difference when it's coming from a private entity and a public sector entity? Because I think the constraints are very different in both those contexts, but I don't know if you find that. We think it might be different in India, but please correct me if I'm wrong.
Yes, well, for one, our law applies to it's omnibus, both to the private and the public sector. And a little bit of history, our first prosecuted case involves a public official. And we came up with a determination 12 months after we were organized. It's important that the citizens realize the full extent of what the DPA can do. But after that, then, pinning your, I would say, betting all your marbles in prosecuting and pinning your success in prosecuting them is not, again, as a DPA, that is already the after effect of some of the situation, meaning that because you are not resilient enough, then you ended up being prosecuted. So that is it's a very, again, a stark reminder to everybody that it can happen. So now we got the attention of all the companies now, the private sector and the government agencies, that this can happen too. Did it ever again after that, when we came up with determination in 2017, did you ever come up with the prosecution determination? Yes, but very sparingly. So when we got their attention, we started educating them now about the importance of compliance, and as Marita told, and companies would realize that complying would be really a competitive edge for them, and there's no need for you to be shamed. And but if you will analyze it, there are only very few touch points that we have with the customers. One is we reach out to them by through promotion and education. One is when they complain to us, right? And third is when companies, I'm talking about companies rather, right? So we reach out to them when somebody complains against them, right? And the third is when they notify us to breaches. Breach notification is an intelligent, it's really more of it's an intelligence gathering tool, because through breach notification you get to you realize the situation of industries and their vulnerabilities. In which case, if you have an idea of how the current or present risks and the vulnerabilities, then you can intervene through policy, advice, information, dialogue, and support. So you have to determine the levels of intervention. So I will go back to your question, Alalita. So if there is a complaint, then it's probably there is a company who is not complying. Right, so complaints are they are signs that somebody is not complying here. So as I told you, when I will look now at the non-compliant companies, is this company deliberately, willfully breaking the law? Or is it they're not complying because they just don't understand it? Right? So you have to also look at them. Do they have the resources to do so? And we told them, you know, if they just have to follow 5 simple steps to comply, appoint your DPO, know your risk through a privacy impact assessment, having a privacy plan, demonstrating your privacy practices, and fit preparing for breach. So really, the first sign for me is there's a complaint and a company and a call on which company is being complained about. Do they have a DPO? If they have a DPO, check, we contact the DPO. DPO, we have a complaint that has come to our attention. Has it passed you and reached you? If there's no DPO, then there's the red flag, right? Then that triggers now the action. There's no DPO, why? Then probably, is this again a company that is willfully, deliberately hiding from us? Because again, we train our best resources, our guns, to those who are willfully putting people at risk. Because we do not have all the resources in the world to address every type of complaint or every type of issue. So we have to put our resources and maximize it, minimizing the risk and addressing threats to those who are actually creating real risk of severity and harm. So that is the way we do it here.
Becky, I didn't know if you wanted to add anything as a kind of final word. And also, I suppose to ask you, how do you build credibility while doing that? I think that's the big question, but the final word to you.
Yeah, I think that is the note on which I would end, because credibility is extremely important, and that credibility kind of also ties into how you deal with the government agencies that are perceived to be very close to you. So enforcement against government agencies is very important, and I agree with Marek. There are myriad of powers, and for me, I think the strongest power a DPA has is to stop the processing of particular activities, you know, when it perceives that that activity is infringing on the compliance with the law, and that is one of the key areas. And no doubt, naming and shaming really helped with the public sector image, because for public sector is all about the image. But one of the things that we also had in our law was that all the various key arms of government, the executive, the judiciary, and parliament, the law had actually designated critical leads there as the data protection officers. And the law already designated these officers. And so that placed a strong responsibility on them anytime we flagged that. But we never really had the opportunity, apart from the naming and shaming, which really helped. But like I said, we continue to have a few, especially other regulators, coming in and saying this law does not comply with us. This law, we are a regulator in our own rights, and so we do not need to respect the data protection laws. And for us, some of those conversations had to boil down to dialogue again, to let the people identify the challenges around that positioning. So a lot of the time with government agencies, one of the things we observed right from the beginning was that they were also incapacitated. They did not have enough resource and knowledge to be able to comply. So once we were already on that approach to, you know, bringing everybody, both public and private sectors, on identifying data protection, not as a legal obligation per se, but as something that will help with credibility. So I remember we started a campaign around the importance of data protection and how it can even eliminate corruption, right? And bring up openness and transparency. And that really helped bring the ear of all the critical government sectors to listen a bit more and to put in methods, because we saw it as one of the critical and most important ways to ensuring, you know, transparency and openness. which government in itself has always been seeking to do. It was also one of the strategies to ensure that government knows where it's keeping its records. And government has always been struggling, especially when it comes to using data for statistics and all of that. So we looked at all those opportunities that we had, and then you can leverage on that as a way of communicating how important this is. But invariably, I must say, it's always extremely challenging when it comes to enforcement within government. And the only way of doing it is to ensure that the regulator is very, very independent and separated from, the realm of the executive government. That can be very challenging in places like ours. So you really have to find a way of navigating that.
I had a question. There's a great question from Amit Mathur in the comments. How much time do you think should be given for companies to become compliant with the data protection regulation? I know that with the GDPR, there was 2 years, but what do you think is a reasonable amount of time? Because at this point in time in the Indian law, there doesn't seem to be a time frame given.
We had a time frame, but we didn't even stick to our time frame. The reason was that we were not even ready. So one of the key actions that had to happen was registration of data controllers. And you don't have resources. You have to build a system or a structure around registration. One of the things we realized at the time with a staff of 5 was that there was no way we could register our data controllers across the country manually. So you have to leverage on technology to be able to do that. And that took a bit of time. But of course, we gave ourselves the first 3-4 years of awareness creation, and then used the last part of those 3-4 years to start the registration exercise, albeit not aggressive. But then as time went on, as we got closer to the 5th year, then we started the critical enforcement and push drive to make sure that at least people are registered. In all, I think initially we had conceived a strategy that took us between 5 to 10 years to really ensure the operationalization of the law effectively. So I think that those are things you should really leave to the regulator to strategically, because even when the law says start next month and they start lining up and you're not ready, you would face a stiff challenge, and that in itself can even undermine your ability to build the institution properly.
Marek, your take on time?
Yes, I think the 2 years. So so the law has been made public in the official journals. Everybody can read that. Of course, nobody reads official journals, but the company and other organizations, the chambers, industry chambers, for example, the civil rights organizations, they read that and they can interpret it and also offer solutions, technical solution, processes, design, and something like that. So I think the 2 years were fair for the GDPR, especially because we had from 1995 already a directive, in principle not so different. So everybody should have had all the safeguards already in place, perhaps in another way of phrasing. And of course, there's some new concepts now, but so the 2 years were fair, but still it did not work, especially if you think about data protection impact assessment, something like that. I think because people underestimated that it's really something they should understand, not only from their knowledge, but also in the company, it has to be communicated. It has to be a process for data breach notifications. People have to be made aware. And therefore, 2 years is ambitious. It's not totally unrealistic, because I assume that each company and each public service already calculates risks because of reputation damages or non-compliance because of other things. And of course, security of the assets is something which should go for granted. So perhaps data subject rights, data protection impact assessment, some notifications if necessary. So this is on top, but it should start somewhere. And at least big companies often have already information security management systems, And then we need something in parallel for data protection management. But if you don't understand that the 2 years time is kind of wake up call and you should start working immediately, then 2 years are not sufficient, but 5 years are not sufficient either.
So just one last question for you, Marek. Given the, there's a question from Parth on chat saying that given the complexity and scale in India, there would be probably a need for multiple DPAs, but it looks like we're only going to get one. How is a one-stop shop, one-stop mechanism actually working, and what if you had to set that up, what are the first few steps that you would take?
So for us in Germany, we have the federal system, meaning we have a federal data protection commissioner, in principle not competent for many things, only telecommunication and some business, some centralized and also public bodies on the federal level. But the companies are regulated now in the Länder, and we have 16, and so many data protection authorities. In one, in Bavaria, they have even 2, one for the public and one for the private service. And here the challenge is, of course, also resources still, but also how to harmonize the views. And therefore we set up working groups, and they have working for decades meanwhile. And if we find, sometimes we have task forces if we need to be much quicker, but this is something which has been built for decades. So when I started work in 1995, media or telecommunication or technology, they were already covered. Also employee data protection, health, something on schools, so that it's something more sectoral. And also because there's the basics in the regulation, that it's insurances or something like that, some business models. There were some more general one like economics, so everything which is with companies. So this is again some umbrella task force or working. Right now we are setting up systems that we can be much quicker in harmonizing what we decide, and because we are independent, let's say queens and kings, and we don't have to cooperate principles because we are so independent. While everybody agrees, I think it does not make sense to have different opinions, and it happens with courts, of course, as well. So if we have a legal proceeding and a court ruling in one of the states says, but this is now the way to go, then the DPA would not probably tell them, no, my colleagues in the other Länder have discussed it and you're wrong, dear court. So this federal system should be a checks and balances. I think in general it works, but we have also the feeling we need to have more guidance, which is really clear and that it makes sense to have all the arguments together. And I think we learned from differences. I'm in favor of having differences because very often the cases have been different. And then we have to discuss why did we decide differently, and then understand proportionality issues or different arguments, the technology progress. And so this is something very good. So if it's possible, I'd like some regional differentiation, which is also good because the northern people and the southern people in Germany are quite different. I'm one of the northern people, and we can cooperate, of course, but still the culture is a little bit different. And it's sometimes easier to approach here with the cultural setting and having a regional responsibility. Still, if it's about branches, so the same sector, it should not be defined as this is regional differently, so that does not work. So having at least, if you don't have more DPAs, perhaps at least the possibility to set up some regional competence centers to spread the word, to be available for example, teaching, because otherwise we have to drive 1,000 kilometers to reach the people. And therefore, I think it's much easier here. We have a small state, but people can come to our office, or we can host some organizations, some events here. And it's not a necessity to go to the big capital or somewhere where there's already a concentration. And therefore, I'm in favor of having more, but again, you are restricted. And perhaps it's the next step in building up your DPAs and the organization, the operationalization, the teaching facility, something like that. This could be different.
We have so many questions to ask you, and I will be in touch post this, but thank you so much for taking time. I'll leave the closing comments to Malvika. Thank you so much.
Likewise, I actually had follow-up questions for each of you whenever you spoke. So I hope to be in touch, and I hope we can do maybe a second part of this. I did want to say, I think we've covered more than I thought was possible in an hour and a half, which is what we ended up having. But we've really touched on everything from leadership to collaboration, tactical things around intersectoral coordination, tactical issues around enforcement, criminal and administrative orders. But I did want to flag for this audience all the things I had on my list we couldn't get to, which maybe is the second part of this conversation. This entire idea of how do you, what are accountability? We've been talking about holding others and, accountable. What are accountability and transparency mechanisms for the DPA, which will in its own functioning have a lot of power, and will also be holding a lot of data. So this whole idea of, how does that DPA then become accountable to the public? How do consumer complaints start feeding its enforcement action? Can they? And then, of course, the big one, which is how can we try and do more supervision? In India, we have this idea of significant data fiduciaries. I know that it came up in Commissioner Libera's comments as well, and I think you had mentioned as well, certain more risky areas of the data protection market or the data market, as it were. But perhaps, for ex-ante supervision and all of these ideas around accountability, we have a separate discussion. But for today, I think I couldn't have said it better. We started with this. It seems like everyone agrees with great power comes great responsibility. Spider-Man said it first, but with that, thank you to all of you for the work that you do in keeping our world safer. And I do hope that we have an Indian DPA soon to join your community. And thank you, Nikhil, for organizing this.
Thank you.
Thank you, Malvika. Thank you, everyone. And I'd like to invite Dr. Ralph Sauer to PrivacyNama. Ralph? Just a short introduction. Dr. Sauer is the Deputy Head of Unit International Data Flows and Protection in the Directorate General for Justice and Consumers at the European Commission, which is the European Union's executive arm. He's been one of the key negotiators of the EU-US Privacy Shield and the adequacy arrangements with Japan and Korea. He has also led the European Commission's work on new model clauses for data protection contracts, the SCCs. At a multilateral level, Dr. Sauer has represented the European Commission in negotiation on the modernization of Council for Europe Convention 108, which is the only binding agreement on data protection, and on the also on the Budapest Convention. Welcome, sir, Ralph, to PrivacyNama. Thank you for being here.
Thank you very much also from my side for the invitation. I'm very glad and honored to join you today. And I'm already very sorry that I have probably created already some confusion. I had connection problems and
not a problem, Ralph. We got more time with the privacy commissioners, and I think we had enough questions left over that we'll be in touch with them soon. But Ralph, just going back to adequacy, we had a conversation yesterday on this push for sovereignty and essentially data protection regulations being a means to enforce sovereignty and also kind of splinter the internet. I was just wondering, and yours is a role that enables adequacy with the EU and effectively allows cross-border data flows and perhaps works counter to that current status of the push for sovereignty through data protection regulation. I was just wondering that in terms of how you work, in terms of engaging with governments for enabling adequacy, when do you step in? When do you start engaging with governments? When do you decide that it's time to talk to a government about enabling adequacy?
Yeah, thank you very much for the question, because I think that's indeed something that's important to clarify. An adequacy finding is first of all an instrument among several others that we have in our rules to facilitate data flows. And it's something which we obviously do not impose on another country. I mean, formally speaking, an adequacy finding is a declaratory decision, if you wish. It's a decision which my institution, the European Commission, as the executive arm of the European Union, can take, and it recognizes that a third country has, let's say, a broadly similar or comparable level of data protection. And when we make such a decision, which is essentially a finding based on an assessment, then this allows the free flow of data to that third country. And that is something which we do upon request, first of all, of third countries. So third countries, and that's how it typically starts, approach us with, first of all, an informal request, whether we would be willing to engage in a dialogue, because, as I said, an adequacy finding is based on a very thorough assessment, and therefore it requires a certain dialogue, meetings where you go through the rules of the third country, and of course the third country has to be interested in doing that, in going through this exercise. And many countries are, because they see the benefit of such a finding because of the free flow from the European Union, which is of course very important to offer services in the European Union or to European customers, which in today's world often requires to obtain personal data from the European Union. So it's we typically do not proactively reach out to third countries to ask them whether they would be interested in doing that, but we are approached. We then usually tell countries that, and that's also often a request from their side, that this is not made public, that this is that we have a confidential conversation on this, because of course it's not a given that it is possible to have an adequacy finding, because it depends on the third country data protection rules, and therefore we usually have exploratory talks to see whether it is, broadly speaking, feasible, and then we leave it to the third country to make it public if they wish to do so. Otherwise, we keep the talks confidential, of course, up to the point that we adopt a draft decision. If the talks are successful, at that point it of course becomes public, but we leave that also to the third country to protect their interests in they don't want a negative finding, of course, or an expression from our side that unfortunately it's not possible. So it's relatively informal, that's part of the process. Later on there are specific procedural steps that are required under our law. But this early period and the initial approach is informal and as I said, comes usually on the initiative of the other country.
So are there also conversations that take place before the law is finalized in terms of what would make it easier to get adequacy, or is this usually post facto? Because changing laws in a country is not an easy task once it's been passed.
Right. So of course there are quite different situations depending on which third country approaches us. Sometimes it's a country that has an established data protection law, and then we'll have to work basically with what is there. Countries then sometimes nevertheless decide to maybe put in place some additional safeguards if there are certain relevant differences that we need to bridge. That is, for instance, how we did it with Japan. But indeed, there are other situations where we are actually approached by a third country during the process of drafting a data protection law, and I would think that's indeed actually quite a good moment to start the discussion, because that allows us, if the third country wishes to have our view, to discuss whether there are certain elements in the draft law which could become problematic later on for an adequacy assessment, and then the third country can take this into account. Of course, the third country is fully sovereign and has to make its choices whether they want to pursue a certain path or whether they are ready to adapt, maybe because it's very important for them to make an adequacy finding possible. But that's, again, something that we do in a confidential setting with a third country. And yes, we sometimes then provide our observations on a draft law, for instance.
So can you give us some examples of the decision-making process while working on an adequacy finding or an adequacy negotiation? You've been involved with both Japan and Korea, and without getting into specifics because those might be confidential, but could you give us an idea of how this entire process works?
Yes. So I've already spoken about the starting point. Some countries, but that's not a formal requirement, but some countries prepare themselves a kind of self-assessment. So they themselves assess and describe in a document their data protection law and maybe the surrounding rules of their system that are relevant, like on judicial redress or other important elements. So that sometimes happens. Sometimes it does not. It's not necessary. It just can speed up the process, and they do so against. We have the rules in our data protection law, but we also have guidance from our data protection authorities on how to apply the adequacy test. So basically what that means in terms of safeguards that we need to assess and find in a way in a third country law. And so the self-assessment is then done typically against that guidance paper from our data protection authorities. We then go through a process or a phase where we have calls, meetings with the third country, where we basically go through their data protection law. And we might talk about this later on. Also, certain aspects of certain other elements of their legal regime. For instance, the limitations and safeguards for access by criminal law enforcement authorities to data, or by national security authorities, because that is part of our assessment that we need to carry out. So we have a discussion on this. We basically slowly go through the law. We ask questions. We ask whether, I don't know, there are implementing rules, whether there are guidance papers, anything which further illustrates and explains how these rules apply. And then at some point when we have sort of are close to finalizing our assessment, we will then have a discussion as to where we see the gaps or whether there aren't any. So we give our view as to whether an adequacy is finding on the basis of what is there is possible, or whether there are certain areas where we see relevant differences, because not every difference is of course of importance, but if they're really crucial differences, then we very often then discuss whether there's a way to bridge these gaps, as I said, for instance, through certain additional safeguards that apply at least to data transferred from Europe. And then we draft a decision, an adequacy decision, which we then typically share as a draft also with the third country, so that they can tell us whether we have correctly understood what our conversation has brought out. And then this draft decision is endorsed by the European Commission at high political level, but as a draft, and then sent as a draft to our data protection authorities, which come together in the European Data Protection Board. So that brings together all the national data protection authorities. They prepare an opinion on our draft decision, and then when this decision is public, and we are usually also available to the data protection authorities to answer questions and explain certain things. Then we look at the opinion. We see whether there's something which still needs to be addressed or clarified. So we might have a bit more work on the decision, and maybe some more contacts with the third country. And then basically the last two steps are we have to go to our member states, the EU member states. There's a special committee with representatives from the member states with which we discuss this, and they vote whether they give a green light, a majority vote, and then once we have the green light, we adopt the decision. So those are the formal steps.
That sounds like a extremely complicated and also a very political process that involves aligning a lot of people. I was just curious if you could illustrate it with an example without, I know this is politically sensitive, so without naming a country, could you illustrate with an example where something of this sort might have happened?
I mean, our decisions are public, so you can see with which countries we have done this in the past. What I cannot talk about is with whom we are doing it currently.
No, I was asking more from the perspective of a particular clause or a particular issue that may have, and I just wanted to get an understanding, because there's probably never going to be a situation where there'll be exact one-to-one mapping of a country's law with the EU. So maybe if you could share examples of what is an absolute no-go versus what is perhaps negotiable versus what is always the case where it's easy to have adequacy, and how are those decisions made?
Right, but that's a point that in any event I wanted to address, that adequacy is not a requirement of identity. So that is absolutely clear also from our case law. It requires a high level of convergence, but it does not require, as you say, point-to-point identity. We are not expecting that any third country has basically a photocopy of our rules. So what is important is that there is a very comparable level of protection, and that certain essential elements are there. For instance, certain rules on purpose limitation, certain rules on data security. It is also essential that there is that certain rights are guaranteed to individuals, that there's oversight by an independent authority. That is an essential requirement. Or condition, not a requirement, but how we have to assess this under our rules. So that's why we have been able to adopt adequacy decisions with a number of countries with very different systems, which shows you that it's not about point-to-point identity. So if you want to have examples, I mean, so for instance, different countries might have different legal basis for grounds for processing, and that is okay, but it's important that they are framed, that there are limits to this, that there's also an element of necessity and proportionality, that data is not just cannot be processed for whatever reason or on whatever basis, but it's not that the legal basis have to be identical, because each country identifies, for instance, different public interests for which maybe data can be processed. So that's where I mean, if there would be no rules on grounds for processing, I mean, no rules that limit on which basis you can process data, that would be an issue. But if there are differences in how they are formulated and for which particular interest, in particular public interest, processing is allowed, that is not an issue. And certainly there can be differences in, for instance, how the exceptions to certain rights are formulated. Again, because this is typically done on grounds of public interest, and they don't have to be identical, but again, they need to be framed. They cannot be unlimited. You cannot sort of undermine individual rights by having very open-ended, broad exceptions. So that's the margin sort of in which we can discuss things. But it's actually a fact, and it's a good fact, that we see a lot of convergence around the world on core principles, obligations, rights, rules on international data transfers, and supervision by an independent authority. Those are actually you find in most of the modern data protection laws. Again, there are differences in the details, but it's actually not so often that we see that something like a real core principle, for instance, is missing, because those are frankly common sense principles. Purpose limitation, that you have limited retention of data, it cannot be unlimited. That you have certain principles to minimize the use of data, not to use data for whatever and how long and to the extent you want. So yeah. So there are. It requires some discussion. You say it's super complex. I'm not so sure. I mean, this can. It doesn't have to take that long. Of course, it depends a bit on how close the third country law is. And at which pace we can go. We have been able to do something very quickly with countries that are quite close to us. Sometimes it has taken longer. Sometimes it has also taken longer because, of course, it makes a difference in terms of what language we speak, whether we can have easy access to the laws that are available in the third country, or they require translation. And things like this. Sometimes we have had situations where in the third country there was, as I said, ongoing legislation, which of course then we need to wait for. So it's not easy to compare one from the other, but I don't think, I mean, it's essentially three phases. There's a phase of discussions with the third country to establish what the law is, and measured against certain core principles and rights and obligations. There's a phase of where our data protection authorities look at this and give an opinion. And then there's a last phase where, in the light of the opinion, we discuss with our member states and certain changes which we might introduce, we discuss with our member states. And that phase, for instance, that doesn't take very long, very often. If we are careful, we can do this quite quickly. So I wouldn't say it's overly complex, but of course, it's the benefit is huge, and therefore I think it's worth the effort to make this assessment.
So if in principle you're seeing an alignment, like you said, with data protection regulations across the globe, at least in principles, why is it that so few countries have been approved under adequacy requirements?
Well, first of all, in many parts of the world, those are quite new developments. If you look at Asia, many countries like your country, Pakistan, Sri Lanka, Indonesia, they are currently Vietnam, Thailand. They have just finished a legislative process, or they are in the process. But the drafts law that we see are quite converging, for instance. And the countries that were most advanced, which are Japan and Korea, we have already an adequacy finding, or we are very close with Korea to adopt it. And the same in Latin America. It's quite a recent phenomenon that these countries have, first of all, at regional level, established data protection principles, which are the Ibero-American data protection standards, which are quite close to the standards that we have in the EU. And on this basis, now many countries have legislated or are legislating. You might know that Brazil just recently adopted a data protection law. Ecuador has just done so. Paraguay is in the process of doing so. And the countries that already had it, which were Argentina and Uruguay, we have an adequacy finding. So I think it's partly a question of time, and I hope we now also see many developments in Africa, and I hope that also there we will soon be able to also engage in such assessments. And the last point, again, it's a question also of these countries reaching out to us. And where this doesn't happen, again, we are not imposing ourselves on these third countries, and there are other transfer tools. Adequacy is not the only transfer tool.
So we'll get to that in a bit, but I just wanted to, if you could explain what are the key sticking points that you come across if a country and India has already fared a fair distance through in terms of finalizing its data protection law. But if a third country was going to work on a data protection law and wanted adequacy, what would be the key points that you think that they should keep in mind in order to get a positive response in terms of adequacy with the EU? Like, what are the main sticking points that you see with countries that don't have adequacy? And therefore, what should a country work on that if it's coming up with a new law?
Yeah, again, I mean, just in terms of the question, I mean, it's not that we sort of assess every country in the world and we have a list of for which countries we cannot have adequacy and for which we can. It's once we get a request, we assess whether it is possible.
There are always points that stand out, right? There are always points that stand out.
Well, I mean, things that we see is, I mean, certainly there is sometimes a question of coverage of the law, and in particular, whether there are big carve-outs for certain economic sectors, or large powers for the government to exempt parts of the data protection rules for certain sectors or certain processing activities. It is possible to have a partial adequacy finding, but it makes it much more difficult sometimes to then design an adequacy finding such that it can still work with the type of carve-outs and exemptions that are possible under third country law. So our advice is always, but that's not just an advice for adequacy. I think it's an advice for or good advice in a way from a domestic perspective to have a horizontal data protection law that covers all sectors and including the public sector. And then, of course, you can think about whether for certain types of safeguards, for instance, for certain rights, there can be exceptions in certain circumstances, because that's, of course, absolutely normal that those are not absolute rights. You can have limitations, but they should be necessary and proportionate and tailored to the specific other interests that you're pursuing, public interest, for instance. So, but that usually does not require that you completely exempt, I don't know, the financial sector from the rules, or the government or public authorities as a whole. So that's one area I think that we often see. We sometimes see that the rules on international data transfers are a bit rudimentary. Let's say that sometimes they're actually quite strict. That's also probably not good. It's not a problem from an adequacy point of view, but it's actually probably not helpful for the country if you're too strict, because I think you should also allow data flows with protections. But sometimes they're also too loose, too undefined. It's not clear sort of what limits or what safeguards have to be in place for international data flows. And unfortunately, I mean, our concept and the way it has been developed also in the case law from our highest court, we have to look at not just how the data will be protected in the third country for which an adequacy finding is thought, but also could it be then onward transferred from that country yet to another country without protections? Because then obviously in a world where data flows easily, the protection is incomplete. So that's the second area which I think sometimes we see issues. On the rights, sometimes the exceptions are quite broad and maybe too broad. Again, it's quite normal to have exceptions or I should call them limitations, restrictions. But they should themselves be framed, we believe, because otherwise this undermines the rights. And then maybe a last point is on the supervision and oversight. So whether there is an authority and whether that authority is independent, which we believe is important, it makes a lot of sense, is actually helpful, because only then can it be a kind of neutral arbiter between the different interests at stake, for instance, business on the one hand and individuals whose data is processed on the other. And it's particularly important, of course, when the public sector is covered by the data protection rules, because how can a body supervise if it itself is part of the executive I mean, it can be part of the executive branch, but if it's hierarchically under the executive, then that creates issues. And sometimes also, of course, the powers might be too limited. I think an independent supervisory authority also has to be effective in what it can, how it can investigate, which tools it has for that, and which measures it can impose at the end. And this doesn't have to be necessarily sanctions, although sanctions are also important as a deterrent. But also the other instruments, such an injunction or a warning. I mean, it's important that there are sufficient powers to not just have a law on the books, but a law that really is complied with in practice. So those are maybe some of the most typical issues that we encounter. And you mentioned that there are measures outside of adequacy requirements for enabling cross-border data flows. What are the other tools in your arsenal for enabling this? Yeah, although it's not easy to always get sort of reliable data on that, but the studies that have been carried out in the past by private entities or associations show that probably the most important tool in terms of volume of data flows from the EU are the model data protection clauses. We call them standard contractual clauses, but that's just the term that we use. Those are basically pre-approved contractual clauses that only deal with the data protection safeguards that the, let's say, data importer, so one of the contractual parties, has to comply with, and that can be added or plugged into a commercial contract, which then regulates, of course, all the other things: what service you request, what money, what fee, and so forth. But this is a set of clauses that really addresses only the data protection safeguards, and is designed in a way that it also guarantees rights for the individuals whose data is transferred. So it creates so-called third-party beneficiary rights, and it requires that the parties submit themselves to the jurisdiction of a certain court where these can be invoked. So that's the most important tool, I would say, and in my view, it's actually also one of the most easy to handle and most cost-efficient tools, because those clauses are fixed, they are pre-approved, so you don't have to negotiate them any longer, and you don't have to spend money on doing that. You just have to fill in there's an annex usually where you have to describe the transfer, but that's basically it. So especially for small and medium-sized companies, that is a very effective tool to use.
But a contract between two entities can't override the law that's operational on one of those entities in a country. So how does this work?
Right, but it can certainly, in terms of, let's say, the pure data protection requirements for the data importer, it can certainly add to what is there. So even if there are very limited requirements on companies how to protect the data, you can nevertheless contractually commit to more. So that is certainly something where you can add, and therefore you might be able to transfer to a country which doesn't have a data protection law or has one which is relatively weak, let's say. Then there is the other question, perhaps, and that's something that recently has become a bit the focus. If there is, let's say, excessive, abusive, disproportionate interference by the public authorities in a third country. That is something which, under our case law, we now have to also take into account. Something that we are still sort of working out a bit. And indeed, of course, a contract cannot bind the public authorities of the third country. And that's why instead, there's a certain obligation on the parties to assess whether there are real problems in the country of destination. And if there are, to think about maybe additional safeguards, for instance, encryption of data, or to challenge requests in the third country which they consider as unlawful, where they have reasonable indications that they are unlawful. So those are the kind of additional safeguards, let's say, that indeed they don't commit or bind the third country authorities, but where the parties can do something in addition to avoid problems. But again, this is only if in the third country there is really disproportionate or abusive government access. It does not mean that there cannot be government access in the third country, because that's absolutely normal. Every country has that. Every country allows regulatory bodies to request data in certain situations, or the criminal law enforcement authorities to request data in certain situations, or the intelligence authorities. So that is per se not a problem. It's more a problem if really this is, as I said, disproportionate, abusive, and certain core safeguards, for instance, individual redress, are not available.
Thank you for that. In fact, there's a question from Bani that I was just going to ask in any case. What has been the impact of the SENS 2 judgment on adequacy findings and also on the SECs?
So I don't know whether the audience will know what to make out of Schrems 2, but so you're referring to recent, well, now it's 1 year ago, a bit more, a judgment from our highest court in Europe, so to speak, our Supreme Court in Europe, and indeed dealt with the questions that I just described. So the question of disproportionate government access in a third country, and it basically decided that this is also something that needs to be taken into account, because again, otherwise the protection is incomplete. You expose someone's personal data to high risk in a third country, and that needs to be addressed. For adequacy, leaving aside, of course, the country for which this was decided, and there it plays quite an important role. But in general, I don't think it changes so much for adequacy, because because the main principles that the court establishes there is government access in a third country should be framed by legal rules that are transparent, and set out the limits and safeguards. That these safeguards should include the necessity and proportionality principle, and that there should be a way for individuals to enforce their rights, and in particular an avenue to court to have judicial redress. Those are the, if you look at the part of this judgment that deals with adequacy, that's what the court has decided. And I don't think those are outlandish propositions. I think those are, in a way, what you would expect in any country that is a country ruled by the rule of law, is democratic, and respects fundamental rights. And if I look to India, to the Puttaswamy judgment, I think that's the kind of thing that the Indian Supreme Court also had in mind. So I don't think it changes that much for adequacy. The situation for the use of model contract clauses has become a bit more complicated. I would grant that, because it requires, as I said, companies now to also carry out this assessment and to think about additional safeguards if there is a real problem in the third country. So that is something which wasn't done in the same way before. I think the requirements are now tighter, and that certainly is a challenge, at least at the beginning. I think this will also, over time, once more information about the situation in certain third countries available, will become easier. But as always, when there's a change in jurisprudence, well, there's a certain time where I think companies need to adapt, and that's the phase we are in currently.
So just in terms of the new SECs, what do they allow in terms of data transfers, and what do they restrict? Well, so they, I mean, they don't restrict anything. It's a transfer tool. It's something that you can use to transfer data, but of course, let's say the price to pay is that you commit to these clauses. So it's a voluntary instrument. You don't have to use it,
When you plug it into your contract, you have to sign it, and like for any other contractual rule, you're bound by it, and you're liable. I mean, you have responsibility for ensuring compliance, and there's a liability rule, which again, like for most contractual obligations, in case of damages, it could lead to compensation, for instance. So that's the worst case scenario, let's say. But they don't limit anything, but they have certain conditions, of course. So they are the safeguards, and they have a certain scope of application, and we have designed them very broadly, so they cover what we think are 98% of all transfer scenarios. So in our terms, and I don't know to what extent those are familiar in an Indian context, we cover a transfer from a controller to a controller. I think you call them data principal, is that? Or in the draft law?
No, in the draft law, we call them data fiduciaries.
Fiduciaries, sorry. So that would be between two data fiduciaries. But we also cover the situation where data is transferred from a fiduciary to what we call a processor. So someone who acts on behalf of the data fiduciary. So basically an outsourcing or service contract. We also cover sort of the next stage, which is also possible sometimes, that the company, the processor itself, sub-processes. So also that scenario is covered. And lastly, we cover the reverse situation where the processor is actually in the EU and the controller is in a foreign country with much more limited obligations, because that is typically a scenario where the data comes from the third country to Europe for processing and then sent back. So hence the more limited scope of obligations. So we have different modules in these clauses to address these various transfer scenarios, because they're all a bit different in terms of the safeguards. That's the positive scope of application, and beyond that you cannot use them. So if you want to call that a limitation, but it simply means that there is a defined scope of application.
After the question from Parth in the comments, he says that how is the reciprocity maintained while determining adequacy in a country? Does it imply that the EU will have a higher responsibility of due care while handling personal data originating from a third country?
Well, I think this brings us back to the standard of adequacy. Adequacy basically, in the way it has been interpreted again by our highest court, means that the level of protection is largely, broadly comparable to our level of protection. That tells you already that, of course, we don't treat ourselves more favorably. We ourselves, we just compare to what also exists in the EU, and EU law does not make a difference between the origin of the data or the nationality of the data subject or the individual whose data is processed or the residence. Our rules apply regardless. And that, of course, means that in the reverse situation where data comes to Europe, it is protected by our rules, which in an adequacy context is broadly comparable to that of the third country. So that ensures reciprocity, of course. Yes.
And a follow-up question there: is the UK likely to lose its adequacy should it deviate too much from the European data protection laws in its upcoming IDTA?
You will understand that that's a rather sensitive question. First of all, these and I guess the person who has asked is indeed suggesting that this is not yet this tool does not yet exist. There's a consultation right now on the IDTA. We are currently assessing what has been put out as a draft, but we will most importantly assess the final outcome of this, because it might change and it can change in any direction. And of course, we will pay close attention to whether this still ensures the continuity of protection of data which would come from Europe to the UK and then would be onward transferred from the UK using the IDTA to another country. So, but we are quite hopeful that also the IDTA will be have a similar level of protection as our standard protection clauses, because the UK data protection regime is virtually identical to the EU data protection regime. As you know, the UK until not so long ago was a member state of the European Union, and it has carried over the data protection rules from that time. So it has, by and large, the same rules as we do. That might also change, and we will also pay close attention to that. But for the moment, the legal framework is virtually identical to ours. And I would therefore think that also the transfer tools that they adopt will stay very close in terms of protection to ours.
So is an adequacy assessment a continuous process? Do you look at how, for example, things might evolve with court judgments in a country, and do you reassess adequacy? Under what circumstances do you reassess?
Right. Our rules require two things: ongoing monitoring of the situation, and then regular reviews. And the requirement is to have these reviews at least every 4 years. But this might be a shorter cycle, which we usually then, of course, discuss with the third country. Especially if it's a new law, it might be better to have a bit of a shorter cycle, because you still, I mean, it's still evolving, let's say. And this is a joint review in the sense that it's basically a discussion which we have, where the third country maybe updates us on any legal developments. They should normally do that while, I mean, on an ongoing basis, if there are relevant developments. That doesn't mean like any change is relevant, but if there's anything major that changes and which we had assessed as an essential element, then we would expect the third country to inform us about this, so that we can see whether this affects the adequacy finding. So the ongoing monitoring is a bit driven also, of course, by whether we receive indications from civil society or from in the press that there could be an issue, and of course, if there's legislative developments, that is typically something which we will pay attention to. But the main instrument, I would say, is the review. So, for instance, now we are currently carrying out the review for the Japan adequacy decision after 2 years after adoption. And we'll have to see whether maybe in the future the cycle will be extended. So, because of course, once rules are in place and stable, then there's probably lesser need for that. So that's a bit what we try to do. Again, I don't think it creates excessive burdens. It's a bit of a dialogue that you have with the third country, and an expectation also that they keep you abreast of relevant developments.
So I'm just curious about whether you feel that there are any challenges with the draft data protection bill in India, and what do you think might end up being sticky points or key sticking points?
Okay, so maybe a couple of points on this. So first of all, it's a sensitive thing. I'm not going to pronounce myself in detail on something which is a sovereign process in India, and where we probably ourselves would not be too amused to if the same would happen when we are legislating. We have been in contact with the Indian government. We have been in contact with the Indian Parliament, and shared certain observations. And I think that's the right way to do it. And again, this is just input. It's sharing our experience, and obviously it's for India to sovereignly decide on what is best for India. And then the other constraint I have is that I only know the draft that was submitted by the government to the parliament, which was quite some time ago, and I don't know to what extent it has further evolved or developed. What we saw at the time, I mean, maybe and it links a bit back to things that I said we often see. I think we had some question marks, if I can put it like this on some of the grounds for processing, in particular maybe for public authorities, whether they're always sufficiently framed. And the corollary to this, perhaps, I think there was a clause at some point that allowed for quite broad exceptions from the data protection rules. And again, that let's say puts a bit of a shadow over the law, I guess, if you don't know whether at some point on grounds of public interest or public policy, the certain safeguards would be limited or completely restricted. So I think those were two areas. On let's say data transfers, we saw that on the one hand, and I know this is a discussion which I think other countries also had with India, is that sometimes the law is quite strict in terms of not allowing data flows, so data localization. Again, that is less an issue for an adequacy finding. It's more a question that as a partner of India, we are concerned with in terms of trade and also maybe fragmentation of the internet. But then on the other hand, there were not. We had the impression that when there's no data localization rule, there weren't very strict rules on how to protect data when it can flow. So that's maybe, that was sort of the other side. So we had the impression that the transfer rules maybe sometimes are too narrow and sometimes too broad. And then I think we believe that the supervisory body, the Data Protection Authority, is meant to be independent, we believe, from what we saw. But I think there were some provisions which maybe put that a bit into doubt in terms of the government being able to give directions to the authority and things like this. So again, I think we always advocate for and promote a fully independent authority for the reasons that I mentioned earlier. So I think that's also something where we our observation would be maybe these sort of vestiges of possible influence. It's better maybe not to have them and really trust that such an authority can function and will do very good for India without the need for the government to still in a way keep control over it. So those were maybe some of the points. And then I don't know. I think we all know that there's a discussion a bit about to what extent should the law also govern the government access, sort of apply to the public sphere and including criminal law enforcement and maybe national security, in light also of the Putaswamy judgment. I mean, the only thing I can say on this is that we believe it does not create a problem to expand the data protection rules to that area, because you can have limitations of certain safeguards and rights. But rather than having broad, I mean, not covering this sphere at all, I think the better alternative might be to cover it, but then to have tailored exceptions or limitations where this is needed to protect legitimate public interests, for instance, to protect an ongoing criminal investigation. So maybe it's a question of how to draft it, and I think that would also help on in many ways, because it then also makes it easier to have regulatory cooperation or criminal law enforcement cooperation, for instance, because of course also there we have to ensure that data is protected in the third country.
There is a question from Amardeep Mathur about whether you have anything to say about the ongoing situation with the transatlantic data transfers. I know you've been involved with those discussions in the past, and just wondering about what you think about that.
Yes, I have been involved in the past, and I'm involved currently. And again, it's obviously a sensitive area, or let's say one which is where confidentiality is particularly important, and trust between the two sides that having these talks. So I cannot say much on that. I think there's a very strong commitment on both sides and willingness and engagement. I think it's clear that because, as you know, that brings me back to the Schrems II judgment. It was the second time that such a decision was annulled, and we cannot risk a third time. And that's why, of course, the judgment is our, let's say, guiding principle, and it relates to a sensitive area because it relates to the area of national security. So that means it's not an easy discussion to have, and one has to have understanding also for the other side. No country easily wants to discuss this area with another country, so it is sensitive, but we're making progress. I'm still hopeful. I am hopeful, but it simply takes some time to work through these things, and I think that's all I can say about it.
Thank you, Raf. Two very sensitive topics right at the end, but thank you for taking those questions, and thank you for your time. We'll now move on to our final session for the conference. We have a fantastic opportunity now to discuss what an organization needs to do to adapt itself to data protection regulations. And I'd like to hand over to Rahul Mathan for taking this forward. Thanks, Raf. Rahul, good to see you.
Hi, Nikhil. Thanks for having me, and I hope you can hear me and see me clearly.
Loud and clear, Rahul. I'd like to request Srinivas, Idris, and Justin to switch on their cameras, please.
Okay, are you gonna say anything, do anything, or am I just gonna jump in?
This is all yours, Rahul. Thanks.
Okay, thanks so much, and welcome to everyone. This is the last of what I hear. I haven't been able, unfortunately, Nikhil, to participate in the previous sessions, but at least I'm seeing it on social media, a set of talks that have been received very well. And this, I hope, is going to be a equally interesting conversation. It was titled when I got it, and I don't know, Nikhil, if it was a typographical error, but it was titled Adapting to Global Privacy Legislation, which reminded me of what my first boss told me. He was a lawyer, and he said, remember not to put in the punctuation, because when you draft an agreement and you leave the punctuation out, if it gets litigated, you can choose where to place the comma. And this feels like one of those sorts of topics, because it is adapting to global privacy legislation, not adapting to a global privacy legislation, also not adapting to global privacy legislations, which it could well have been. And I think in the framing is you've left us with a nice way to get into this current space, which is 2 or 3 years ago, we felt, all us privacy professionals felt the world was converging to a global privacy legislation, which was GDPR. We felt that increasingly country after country was going to adopt the GDPR framework, that this was going to be the gold standard. And I used to call it a viral legislation because it infected hosts. In order to be able to engage with Europe, which is a really important part of the world to engage with, you had to adopt their standards, because otherwise you were not adequate and they wouldn't allow you to participate with them. And we felt that that was the direction in which the globe was going to go. So yes, in fact, this would have been adapting to a global privacy legislation. But over the last 2 or 3 years, we've seen that all's not well with GDPR. And there have been some remarks that even the founder of GDPR is saying, look, there are things that perhaps we should rethink. We know that Europe is currently thinking about a number of additional legislations. There is the Data Act, there's the Data Governance Act, we've got the Digital Markets Act, which of course is a competition legislation, but has an impact on how data is regulated, and therefore I think eventually will have some sort of a privacy impact. And then more importantly, I think countries around the world are taking slightly different approaches to privacy. We've seen Japan, we've seen Australia, and of course India. And India's approach, some will say, is in many ways moves in the opposite direction, but in many ways is based off of the GDPR principles. So the question is the future, and are we going to be looking to adapt to global privacy legislations? Is the future a future where privacy has a few universal principles, but those principles are interpreted locally in slightly different ways or completely different ways? And is that what the future is going to be? And in order to discuss this, we've got a set, probably the ideal panel of chief privacy officers. We have Idris Kechira, who is essentially a US corporation that engages closely with GDPR and, of course, regulations around the world. Idris is the CPO of Match.com. We've got Justin. Justin Weiss is the CPO of Naspers, which, as he frames it, is, as you know, Naspers is a big investor around the world. I think of Naspers as an investor largely in Asia. He says it's a BRICS investor, but an investor that looks at privacy and data security as a strategic advantage. So you've got that perspective. And you've got Srinivas Pusarla, who's the CPO for a long time of Infosys, which is India's big software services company that from India has had to deal with privacy in multiple different jurisdictions. So we really have three very interesting and hopefully very divergent points of view. We're going to have a freewheeling conversation. So just some very quick housekeeping. I'm hoping that I do not have to have a session at the end for Q&A, because I'm hoping that you will all put in your questions and that we can feed it into the conversation. And so just so that you know the structure, we're going to discuss for a brief period of time what it is to be a CPO, what exactly happens in the privacy office as interfaces with all the other departments of the organization. We're going to go into this question of the policy landscape around the world, the fragmented, fractured policy landscape around the world. And we're going to close with some reflections on India's forthcoming data protection law. So that's the broad framework. We've had a very interesting conversation to discuss how we were going to take this. And the end result was we're going to have some broad questions. If there are rabbit holes, we may just end up going deep into the rabbit hole and forgetting about all the other questions. But we're just going to have a discussion. And if that's okay with everyone, I'm going to jump into, in the style of what I hope will be the rest of the conversation, one question for all the panelists, just to set the scene. How would you define your role in the context of your organization as a chief privacy officer? What is it that you do? I know this is a very basic question, but I'm hoping that you will use that as a jumping off point to say how it has changed, because clearly it has changed, maybe even in just the last 3 or 4 years, but it has changed. So I'm going to just leave it out there, and maybe I will turn to Idris to start with initial remarks, move to Justin, and then to Srini, and then that's the last time I'm going to tell people what to do or in which order.
Great, and hi Raul, and hi everyone. I'm super happy to be talking about this. And definitely, going down the rabbit hole. There is nothing that I love more in terms of privacy, right? So to answer your question, Rahul, kind of my role, and I think it may be different from company to company. My role, very much in practice, is kind of two things. The first one is, I'm an attorney, so I'm limiting, the company's exposures. I'm looking at local law and I'm making sure that we're complying, with all of the laws in the countries in which we operate, kind of standard stuff, right, for an attorney. And so I'm looking at all of the laws and researching them, and I'm, reviewing all of our processes, and products and so forth internally and making sure they comply with applicable law. But in addition to this, because privacy is not just a legal kind of requirement, really, it's almost like a company policy, right? Who do we want to be? Like, what do we want to do? Like, what do we want to even tell people who are doing with their data? There's a lot of like policy there and not just legal. And so my role is very much also to just design, what the policy of the group is, and interacting with senior executives at the company to kind of create that design, that image, that who we want to be when it comes to privacy, and then implementing it with my team within the company. So kind of legal and policy, I guess.
Justin, do we need any special skills to do this, or just can anyone just put their hands up and become the chief privacy officer?
I think anyone can put their hands up, but they're pretty quickly going to have to become a unicorn. In my experience, and we've had some very interesting experiences in our group because we have a lot of different business models, different businesses in different countries. In my experience over the past 7 years that I've been in our group, typically jurisdictions or companies begin by assuming that the privacy leader should be a lawyer. And what I've observed is that often people from a TNT style practice, maybe who have some IT background or have some, maybe data transactions background, put their hands up, or they get assigned this type of responsibility, and then they find their way and they discover along the way information about privacy. But very quickly, what they discover is that a legal background is probably not sufficient to give the skill sets, the full suite of skill sets that are necessary to be the chief privacy officer. To lead privacy in an organization inside of a company, you are a horizontal function that touches technology departments, human resources departments, customer care departments. I mean, the list goes on and on. There's pretty much no aspect of the organization these days that doesn't involve data. And so when you appoint a leader to think about data, quickly, the good ones show that they're capable of being sufficiently dangerous on technology, that they really understand how technology works well. They should be excellent communicators, both internal stakeholders for training staff, but also externally to explain what the company is all about with respect to data policy, as Idris was saying. So then you have a communications component that's an expectation of the privacy leader. And of course, indeed, there's quite a bit of legal compliance that one has to look after, whether it's contracts, whether it's specific statutory requirements about disclosures and notices that are published. So there's a really wide range of skills. And I would encourage everyone that's starting to think about this to think of it from that broad perspective. You can take someone with an IT background and teach them some of these other domains. You can take a lawyer and help them develop some of these other skill sets and responsibilities. But at the end of the day, you have to do all of these things well in order to be effective.
And Srini, you've been a privacy officer in a country without a privacy law for a long time, 10, 15 years, something like that?
11 to 12 years, yeah.
Yeah. So, how has your role changed over the years? Because that 12-year period essentially spans pre-GDPR, preparation for GDPR, and now post-GDPR in a country that doesn't require you to even exist, because under Indian law you don't need to exist, but because Infosys has this global reach and deals with every country on the planet, you have in a sense been forced to take that role up. So what has that been for you? And I think that in a sense will set the scene of the different perspectives before we can get into the meat of this.
Right. Thanks, Rahul. Yeah. So I'm the Chief Privacy Officer plus DPO. I play both the roles. Of course, in some certain jurisdictions, this is fragmented, but we went ahead with this. And the role essentially is about providing assurance to the company, to the top management, that data privacy compliance is taken care of as applicable. Now, as applicable, the itself is changing. So as you rightly said, in the last decade, things have evolved. The regulations have become more stringent, tighter, have got evolved into what is called controller, processor. These definitions used to be different earlier. This joint controller. So along with that, there are additional safeguards being introduced by the data protection laws, which required us to, as Justin, I agree with him what he said, rightly said, that the role is not regulatory. Initially, it started with the legal domain. It used to be under legal predominantly. But with laws getting into more prescriptive measures such as privacy by design, data protection by design, understanding of privacy engineering, embedding privacy into design. So all these aspects require one to learn technology, otherwise they become obsolete in no time. So I happen to be an engineer, and later on picked up law in one of the subjects. But I see that today it's a technological function where one needs to understand both technology and law. Otherwise, you won't be able to implement and appreciate the measures that are required to. The role continues to remain one of advisory, I would say, the data privacy across the world. We never get into implementing things. So that way there is no change, but the significance of independence is becoming more and more relevant as we go along because of increased digital convergence for all kinds of data subjects, whether it's consumers, employees, which requires you, I will speak more about it later in the conversation, but which requires this role to be completely independent and report to the board preferably. So in I, for instance, report to the board, and that happened about 7 years ago. Before that, it was a sub-function. So if you ask me evolution, what changed? We started as an independent subunit, became unit, and today it's a completely independent function like CISO reporting to the board. And the perspectives of regulations, of course, are also evolving with technology.
But Shri, I wanted to just double click on some of the things you said, which is how exactly has your interface been with other departments in your organization? I mean, you're constantly dealing. Of course, you certainly do have to provide the board with some independent advice, but you've got pressure from your product teams that want a product to get out. And I think everyone on this panel will agree that your product teams don't like you very much because you're constantly the ones saying that this is not okay, and this really cool little innovation that Match.com is looking to push out. You're the one saying no, you can't, because that violates privacy, and I'm sure you see that in each of your roles. So how do you deal with that? And I think leadership has got its own pressures. As much as they want to comply, I think they also have a responsibility to shareholders. So how do you manage that, and how does the CPO sort of deal with that?
Right. So I think I will touch upon those points which are unique and different for privacy world than other compliance functions. Any compliance function will have common set of challenges. Let me not get into that. So for privacy, I think one of the most important aspects which we need to appreciate, which becomes a challenge if we don't understand. In security world, the adversary is an unknown hacker. It could be an individual, it could be a nation hacker. Entire organization machinery is together to fight that enemy. And we don't know who that enemy is. We will never know, possibly we'll be attacked. So the focus is the entire machinery is together in investments, in decision, in inconveniences that come across because they all want to keep the enemy away. But in the data privacy world, the ones who are adversary are within the organization often. Leaving aside security, the security is one of the important aspects of privacy which continues to remain the challenge. But the privacy aspects are often ones which are conflicting with privacy. They are typically innovation, growth, adoption of new technology. All these require your CIO, CTO, and other departments like marketing, etc., to move forward and take up challenging, innovative technologies in order to embrace the growth, right? And that would become a conflict. And therefore, the role of a CPO is one where a very careful balancing act is required to appreciate the growth of the organization, yet be compliant. So we can put just like a glass is half full or half empty. I would say that instead of saying that we are going to let the organization be compliant, I would say we should put it that we are going to let the organization move forward, embrace growth and innovation while ensuring compliance. That's the way we should put our role rather than putting the other way, right? And so this adversary point is extremely important. And there's another important thing is about privacy strategy. And this point also leads to the fact that the great amount of independence is required. Typically, the requirement to report to the board comes from the fact that the other functions will influence you. So it is very important to have the ability and autonomy to take issues at the top and you are listened properly, right? The other is about strategy. So many organizations do not think a privacy strategy. So they just jump into policy, whether they implement a standard or certification. So it's extremely important to come out with a privacy strategy which is aligned to the business strategy, or vice versa. So this is more relevant for industry which consumes data as raw material, and less for those who incidentally get data. So there are different levels of data consumption, right? A social media giant, for instance, web search giants, their bread and butter completely comes from data. Whereas somewhere e-commerce and banks, for them data comes, they're required to process data, but they can leverage it to use AI, ML to understand, get meaningful insights from the patterns and data, and deliver better value to the customer, sometimes impact the customers, right, in the negative way, adverse way. So the bottom end comes your manufacturing industry, and industry which happens to collect data and they don't want to take any risk at all. So the privacy strategy for all these three kinds of companies is going to be different. And you have to embed this strategy along with your risk appetite, risk strategy for the company, and say that, hey, am I going to take more risk? Am I going to use data for deriving value and thereby take more risks? And I'm okay to have insurance. I'm okay to fight a couple of battles in the court. So it's a company's decision. So some of the companies won't take that risk. So that it's important to appreciate for a CPO, and then then it's easier for day-to-day decision-making process.
Justin,
I can add more, but I think let me.
Justin, I saw you wave a bit. So yeah, just jump in.
Yeah, I appreciated Srinivas referencing some of what I heard was about the analogies to other types of risk management functions, but also ways in which privacy is different. So I'd love to echo that with maybe 2 points. The first one has to do with this concept of risk. A lot of other departments traditionally have focused on risk, and indeed risk for the organization. It's very tempting when we see what's going on with Facebook and we see what's going on with technology companies around the world to think of privacy issues as a risk to the company. But maybe a brand risk, reputational risk to the bottom line. You can frame privacy issues as a kind of corporate risk. And when you do, you might assume that running a privacy program is very similar to running other types of programs that try to manage risk for the corporation. What is unique and different about privacy is that the privacy officer's primary duty and responsibility is to think about risk to a different class. It's risk to individuals. And this is something that I think is very interesting when I work with new chief privacy officers and new data protection officers, to try to expand that thinking beyond, am I doing risk management for the company, or am I doing risk management to help protect individuals? It's a very profound difference. And it sounds simple, but when you force yourself to make a list of risks to people and a list of ways you can manage or mitigate those risks to people, those lists look very different than what would happen in a corporate affairs office about how you mitigate risks to PR and brand and things like that. So that's one thing I'd encourage the audience to think about.
Can I just sort of double click on that a little bit more? Because sometimes these are sort of opposite ends of the spectrum, right? In terms of what you should be doing. Where the minimization of risk to individuals is aligned with the company's interests. And I'm being really provocative, perhaps.
Sure.
It's sort of easy to take that call, but where a company has to choose between profit is a crude way of thinking about it, but just let's take any other company interest, which is diametrically opposite to this protection of an individual. How does the chief privacy officer in those circumstances address this sort of, does that not bring you more closely aligned with other compliance functions where you have to put the company first?
I would say no. And,
okay.
and here's why. And I'm glad you took us there, because that was indeed going to be my second point. You had framed it earlier as a function whose job is to say yes or no. And I would push back against that. I don't think, and we can take the GDPR as an example, and I suspect that our colleague on the prior panel from the European Commission would agree with this. The way privacy legislation and data protection legislation is meant to operate is not to be a checklist of yes and no's. Yes, you can do this, no, you can't do this. It's very, very rare that there's a ban or outright prohibition on an activity. Rather, your task is to counsel the organization on how to achieve its objective. So, for example, if we were to take a controversial algorithm that is suggesting things that may be harming individuals, the question is not, should you take away all algorithms? Yes or no? The question is, what are the features of an algorithm that balance in a proportionate way the needs to do what the algorithm is supposed to do, which is to select and suggest and personalize in some circumstances, with the potential negative impact on individuals. And once you do that balancing work, it's not usually a yes, no, it's a how. It's a, well, let's change this little bit, or let's add this little bit, or let's explain more to people so that we take away surprise elements. So usually the privacy leader has a whole bag of tricks, explaining things more clearly or more succinctly, or maybe in different languages, using icons. That's a whole suite of transparency tools. It could be a suite of data minimization tools. It could be security protocols. It could be bias mitigation risks in algorithms. There's a whole, it could be content specific in the case of an algorithm that's suggesting inappropriate content. So you have to think of this as an entire suite of tools, and you are a utilitarian. Your job is to increase everybody's happiness and sort of flex your muscles as best you can to do so. That's not to say that there won't be the very rare edge case where you have some rogue leader that wants to do something that is flat out harmful to individuals, but I would suggest to you that that's very much the exception and not the rule. And the hard work is in the doing, is in the mitigating, is in the balancing, is in the negotiation about how to achieve the purpose.
I think, Raul, just one comment on this. I think I fully agree with everything Justin was saying. I think something that is important is just preparing the ground for those discussions. And sponsorship is a massively important topic where, you know, to your point, Raul, right? Like at some point there's trade-offs, right? Like it's not like, you know, we're saying, oh yeah, we're going to be great at privacy and there's going to be no trade-offs, you know, whatsoever. Even where we're trying to find that sweet spot as to how we can do something, that how will involve some impacts, right? Like it's going to happen. And so what you need to make sure of is that you got that sponsorship from the outset at the highest level of the organization to make sure that, yeah, like there is a reason, there are trade-offs. Like it's a company, it's like, it's a society, right? People discuss, we find compromises, and so there is going to be a way forward, but people need to appreciate this and they need to understand what the company is all about when it comes to privacy. So you need to find that sponsorship at the highest level, decide who you are, who you want to be, and then everything goes from there. And employees, like everyone we're interacting with on a day-to-day basis, they need to be aware of that, you know, decision, you know, of that policy that the company has, so that when those decisions are taken, they know where it comes from and they know why it makes sense for the company. They know why it makes sense for the, you know, the customers of the company. They understand that whole, you know, that whole perspective essentially. And I will say like another topic, which is, you know, is the business model topic, right? Like some companies, it's easier for them to work under that frame where privacy is going to be at the forefront of everything, where some other companies have a business model that will just be based on something much more aggressive, essentially, on the business side, and it is what it is. And I think, you know, talking about CPOs and what our role is, you know, I think some CPOs are fortunate and some CPOs, you know, have it harder, you know, depending on the company they're in, right, to be honest. And I know, like, just talking about myself, like I'm like, one of the misconceptions, for instance, regarding Match Group that I'm part of is like advertising. And it's always the first thing that I'm saying because it actually impacts my job so much, is that it's only 2% of the revenue that is advertising. If it was more, then it would be much more difficult as a job for me, whereas it's much easier for me to get sponsorship at the highest level where the product is the product. And so we want people to be happy with the product, and that involves them being safe and being, you know, feeling like their privacy matters, because that's also what sells our product. But definitely, depending on business model, the CPO role may be a little bit more, you know, trickier, I guess, depending.
As we're seeing in the news every day. But Idris, I wanted to just sort of underline what you and Justin have just said, because I think India is a country that, other than people like Srini who've been doing this for yonks, India is going to have a whole bunch of CPOs who've never been in this position before. And this idea that you have a completely different bag of tricks from what regular compliance officers have is really important. And I think it's important for people to understand that it's not a yes and a no. It's how to get to that utilitarian point. So I want to ask you. I want to dig a little deeper into this because I think it requires some level of organizational intention within the company. How does the CPO and maybe not just talk from your personal experience, but what would you and everyone else on the panel think? Maybe Srini referenced it briefly in terms of the governance question, but where should the CPO sit in the governance hierarchy? What's the access to the board? How do you establish that framework such that you can get the correct level of sponsorship, you can be effective in the correct way, but at the same time, the company can also reflect its priorities in the appropriate manner in the decisions that you take and the guidance that you give?
So, I mean, I think there's this chief privacy officer, and Srini touched on this a little bit, like chief privacy officers versus data protection officer is an interesting discussion where essentially my view is, if you look at EU has this, pretty well thought out in a way, but there are still many decisions where, it is still difficult to do it, but at least there's been a lot of thinking here. And the idea is the goal is to embed privacy and make sure that, all data processing that is happening at the company is happening with full conscious of the privacy impacts and fully taking those into account and mitigating those impacts. So how can a company put a structure in place to actually allow for this? And the reality is, it's going to completely depend on the company. One of the first things that I always say is, do not copy your structure. It's not going to work. You could be lucky, right? It may happen, but if you just copy a structure, it's not going to work. It depends on where the company is, how big the company is, in what countries the company is operating in. It will depend on what even the senior the structure of the company is. What is legal within this company? What is compliance? What is really how is the executive team structured and that sort of thing. It will completely depend. Generally speaking, I think there is almost like a spectrum, I think, of maturity is the way that I think about it myself, where, the smaller you are, the less you will be able to differentiate roles, right? You will have someone, there's 3 people in the company, you won't have a data protection officer or CPU, separate from those people. And so people will have to wear, different hats. And that's fine. That's what needs to happen at the beginning, at the beginning of the journey, I guess. But as a company mature, I do believe that you need to have someone, the CPO, if at somebody, he or she exists, will need to have direct, reporting line to the board. It doesn't, it cannot happen any other way in my mind. I think the bigger discussion will be whether you want to have that function that Justin was touching on as well, which is the risk for people versus the risk for the company, and whether you want to differentiate those two things by having chief privacy officer on one hand, really advising the company, and then having the data protection officer at least calling out essentially the issues when it comes to users, and then the company can take decisions. So there's probably kind of a spectrum where the more you go, the more you will differentiate roles, and you will put in Chinese walls and so forth to limit conflict of interests over time.
I see Nikhil has put his camera on and raised his hand in flagrant violation of the request to put it into the chat. But Nikhil, you're here. You might as well ask your question.
So Rahul, in the first session of the day where we had the data protection commissioners, I think Marek Hansen talked about how DPOs and chief privacy officers, the way the regulators look at them are that they are an extension of the Data Protection Commission in a sense. So they like to work very closely with the DPOs and chief privacy officers so that most of the complaints stop there and the DPC isn't burdened too much with dealing with complaints. I just was wondering what everyone's views might be on this transference of the burden of the need of actually exercising that regulatory function? And is this something that you're seeing happen across the globe?
Absolutely.
And we've got a question from Vani, which is sort of roughly the same thing. What's the expectations from the regulatory perspective of your so if you could just pick this up, because it's a really interesting and perhaps an unusual way for Indian compliance teams to think about it, where this has been sort of you're in the company and the regulator expects you to act on their behalf in a sense, which is a bit strange for us to think about in the way in which our other regulators.
If I may, Rahul, not anymore after the IT rules.
Oh, come on. Anyway, maybe it's the sign of things to come, right? So if the IT rules are actually looking to have that sort of a role, maybe when the PDP bill comes into force, we're just preparing ourselves for that. And look, if it's a generally beneficial approach, and we've got precedent from around the world as to how to do it, maybe we'll all look at the IT rules with a completely different light. So I don't know, Srini, Idris, Justin, if there are any thoughts that you have, and jump and speak at the same time if you want on this.
Yeah, so Rahul, I fully agree with the point that Nikhil you brought. The data, so increasingly most countries have this provision for data subject rights. So it's not just complaint or issue, but you have full right to reach out to the company, and there are timelines specified in how long you have to take to respond all that. So today it's become like SOC center for CISOs. This has become an operational center where we have to man 25% breaches, DSRs. So as part of this, there are ways to handle. You can just handle it in a manner where you just, for the formality's sake, you handle it and close it. But if the effectiveness lies in listening to these requests properly and leaving aside the frivolous requests, those which are genuine, you have to take it as an opportunity for improvement, correct yourself. If you don't, these same people will go to the data protection authority. So when I meet DPAs, I tell them I behave like an extended arm of DPA. I'm supposed to, if I'm in Spain, I'm ensuring that people don't go to DPA of Spain, they come to me. If I'm not able to satisfy them, they go there. And that's my failure. Right, so that's very important role we need to play in our role, leaving aside the other part of the role over to others.
And if you could, Justin, Idris, if it occurs to you, are there any instances where actually this has played out? Any examples that you can share in a confidential, in this public forum, of how this actually worked out, where you did play this sort of a role and the regulator therefore didn't feel the need to intervene?
Well, yeah, I'm happy to address it. Look, I think I don't actually think it's as novel as it may appear. Particularly in India, we have lots of experience of outsourcing. I think this is just a bit of outsourcing. But outsourcing of what? Let's be very, very practical. Let's imagine there was no such thing as a chief privacy officer or data protection officer, and the government had a data protection authority that handled all issues and all complaints directly. What would people be complaining about? This company did this thing to me and I didn't like it. Things around data subject rights. That's one big category of things that people would be complaining about to an authority. The other thing typically that people complain about are being upset after they've heard about a security incident. So a security breach, I'm afraid that there's a risk to me or members of my family or my children because our data has fallen into the wrong hands. That's what people express proactively as citizens concerns about that a data protection authority would respond to. So they've outsourced this function to chief privacy officers and data protection officers. What does that look like? What it means is, as part of your privacy program, you are expected to receive a certain volume of inbound requests from the public about the privacy practices of your organization. Now, typically, the law will outline the modalities for that interaction. It will set the expectations for how long you can take before you respond to individuals, in what form you should respond, how frequently, et cetera. But at the end of the day, you have a customer care functionality embedded into the DPO CPO role. So that's what it looks like. And that makes sense because remember, this is happening for all companies across India. And therefore, you've got an economy of scale, right? You have a distributed model for dealing with those. And as a result, only those that lead to an escalation or a conflict or something that can't be resolved get referred to the real data protection authority in the government. So that's that part of the model. With respect to security incidents, unfortunately, the bad news I have for everyone in India is that you've all been having security incidents daily. Nobody's just been checking. When you get a data protection law, you will find if you assign the responsibility for people to actually start looking to see if there was unauthorized access to personal data somewhere, you'll start to see all these reports, internal reports. Oh my gosh, maybe we had 5,000 incidents in one day. Well, wait a minute, maybe not. There's minor incidents, there's major incidents, there's low risk issues, there's high risk issues, there's a spectrum. Now, we could report thousands and thousands and thousands of questions to the centralized government authority, or we could ask a trained data protection officer or security officer or chief privacy officer to assess the nature of incidents that occur and escalate and refer and report only those that are material or cross a certain materiality threshold. Again, a distributed model. And I think that that's a useful way to think about it, just from a logic perspective. So when we say the Data Protection Authority tells us, as Nikhil correctly quotes, we expect the data protection officer to report to the highest levels of the company and to be fully independent and to act as our agent, they mean they want the public serviced in that manner, in the way prescribed and described in the data protection legislation.
Just a comment, Rahul, on this. I think it also goes to the tension between, what a DPO should be. Well, we need to embed privacy everywhere within the company. You need to be part of your consulting needs to be heard within the company. But then, if there are the eyes of the regulator within the company, that's not going to happen, right, in practice, because no one wants to have the eyes of the regulator, in the meeting. And I think that was actually taken into account. If you look at the European Data Protection Board's opinion, actually the idea is not that the DPO be the eye of the regulator. I would definitely push back on this. I think they need to be independent, they need to be expert, they need to be embedded within the company and so forth. I don't think they need to be the eye of the regulator. And I think, not putting any words in Justin's mouth, but I think I agree with him in the fact that I actually don't believe that it's shifting the burden of this to companies. I think it makes sense. Companies receive, access requests and deletion requests and that sort of thing. They need to deal with them. And the view of the DPA is, if those are handled properly, nothing should come back to us. So when they receive something, they're coming back to us saying, well, apparently you have some more work to do because that person is not satisfied with the answer that they received. And I think it makes total sense. It's not shifting anyone's burden, right? It's completely normal, right? In terms of logic, I absolutely agree with Justin. I do believe that it's a good way for, there's a number of reasons that happens, right? I looked at the numbers a year ago. I need to look at them again. Just a year ago, just at Tinder, one of our services, we answered 120,000 access requests since, the time we put it in place in the service. It's putting people in control of their data, right? You have a great system. They can go in autonomously, just do this, which is the thing that you want to do. You don't actually have necessarily a legal requirement to exactly do it this way, but we open the door, fully with 120,000 requests. So you're bound to have people that are not satisfied for some reason about the data that they received, in what format the data was available, how it was sent to them. It's a given. It is going to happen, let alone, the fact that the GDPR is more complex than people would assume. There are exemptions, there are a number of things that people do not think about. Well, I have the right to be forgotten, and it is what it is. And people do not think about the exemptions, which makes sense. Not everyone is a legal counsel or a privacy expert, right? And so those things, however you want to explain it to people, a subset of people will go to the regulator, and then the regulator will ask you to further explain it to them and will take a decision. That's just kind of normal practice.
When Nikhil was there for all those discussions, one of the first things we said when we looked at the privacy law was, oh my God, we're going to need to really have a huge DPA. We're going to need to scale this office up. But it sounds from what all three of you are saying, we're going to need to have a big internal organization as well. So, if all this regulatory outsourcing is going to happen, how large must the internal organizations of the companies be? Idris, you're going to say it depends on the business model. I agree, but let's just take, a business case that is quite heavy on the privacy side. How much does a company need to think about ramping up its privacy office? Because I think everyone right now is looking at appointing, the token DPO and leaving it at that. But from what you're saying, it seems like you're going to need quite an organization.
I mean, I think it depends on the processes that you put in place, right? You can have different scenarios. You could have everything centralized and have like a massive, privacy team just doing everything. Like to Justin's point, it's there is a customer care function, in the privacy team. So either you can embed it within the privacy team, or you can do a lot of training of your customer care team and make sure that they kind of represent the DPO almost, when they answer people. So it will completely depend on this, right? Like privacy is one of those things where, you're only as strong as your weakest link. Like everyone plays a role. I know it seems like that, thing that people say, but it's actually true. Like everyone plays a role in terms of privacy, and the role that they're playing will depend on how much you want to give them. Like everyone plays some role, but then you can have processes that put like everyone in motion and give them responsibilities when it comes to privacy, so that your privacy team, doesn't need to be as big, essentially, or you can centralize everything. Like, some companies like to have like internal service centers, to do this. Some others like to make people accountable, in the business functions when it comes to this. There's really not, one way. I know you said I was going to say this, but that's absolutely true. Like there's not one way of doing this, but but for sure, the more data you process, the more, data is important to you, the more scrutinized, your business may be, the more people you will have. But then it can be really a function of like, 1 for 5, depending on how you want to, eventually organize yourself.
Yeah, this is really interesting because I think we've had in all our discussions leading up to the PDP bill, we've discussed what it would take to build the other side of it. I think maybe this is a sign that it is around the corner, because we're getting into the nitty-gritties now. Literally, what does every company have to do? There are 2 questions that have come through that I want to feed you while we're still on this. One is, and whoever wants to take it, what when you've been implementing some of these, and I think this is very much from an Indian perspective, because we're going to be implementing privacy for the first time in some of our organizations. But could you just take it as if you are implementing a new proposal and you have to cascade that, let's just say, Idris, you said right to be forgotten. When it happened, what did it take to cascade that new construct down the organization? How did people respond to it? Srini, I'd like you also to come in, because this right to be forgotten perhaps doesn't really affect Infosys that much, but as someone completely outside and removed from the mandates of Europe, for that to come down, how did we think about that? And then the other question, and perhaps we can link it in some way or take it separately, is what are the things that take the most of your time? Are there 3 things that as privacy officers you end up spending 80% of your time on? Once again, I really don't have the answer to this, but it'll be really interesting for the audience to understand, particularly if it's something horribly mundane, that this is not the sexy thing that you've been painting it out to be this far. But there are some really mundane things that you have to do. So I'm going to throw it out to anyone who wants to put their hand up and just riff off each other. Srini?
Yes. So Rahul, first one was about right to be forgotten. I think right to be forgotten made a huge impact after that famous case of Google versus Spain. That's when we all became educated, and then GDPR came, and it got introduced in 2 forms. One is storage limitation principle, which is business as usual, you delete data. The other is right to be forgotten, where we invoke a right. Obviously, as I think we all discussed, it is not an absolute right, and it has to be applied based on balancing with the other legitimate interests of necessity to keep the data and freedom of information, etc. So in the context of organizations like ours also, we keep getting DSRs. As part of that, there are people who raise I want my data to be deleted, and it is our prerogative to assess and give the feedback that is it possible to delete, because the other compelling needs to keep it, and then that's how the process runs. Of course, in social media company it will be different. I would like others to add. Coming to the other question, it was about privacy. Can you repeat the other question, Rahul? Second one.
Just the things that you need to that are occupying the majority of your time.
Or how much time? Yeah. So that's more about, I think it's about prioritization, or how much time, what is the attention that requires.
No, more Srini, from the perspective of what are the things, there's a whole bunch of things that you have to comply with, but you end up complying with these three things the most. And it could be something really mundane as, I don't know, make it up, some sort of, maybe data breaches is what's the biggest thing for you. That would be quite serious. But anything else?
My question was a little different in terms of, let's say if you take the last few years, what are the three things that you spent most of your time on?
Okay, that's a completely different question. Let's do that as well, because that's an interesting thing, right? So I also wanted to place it in the context of new privacy officers coming in. Just get used to the fact that this is a serious job. These are the things that you'll have to do.
So going back to the first part of your first question, Rahul, the way I've approached it with companies that are just starting out, and I can take examples from Brazil and South Africa, which I think are analogous cases, since they've had European-style privacy laws come online in the past year, and companies fairly similarly situated to India have had to start from scratch with no tradition of doing these programs. The first step, and this echoes something that Idris said, which I would love to amplify, is the CEO themselves. It is the executive leadership team. We start our approach with executive buy-in. The first task is to explain to a non-expert, in this case, the CEO, the full range of activities that will need to occur. The CEO is best placed to say, oh, now that I know we have to do that, you must work with this person in customer care. Now that I know that we have to do that, you must work with this person in legal. Now that I know we have to do that, I want this person in IT to be responsible for that process, et cetera, et cetera. You need the executive team to make those assignments. Or they may charge a unitary senior figure and say, you're the senior executive in charge of all of these things, but you come with my mandate. So that when you go to each of those departments, you can say, Rahul sent you. That's a very important starting point, to then embed something completely novel and completely new. Why? Because it has to be part of the business goals of each department. People are rewarded and recognized for doing work that their bosses expect of them. If their friend, Justin, comes and expects them, and it seems like a favor, they may try to help me out, but it's very different than if the boss, Rahul, says, you've got to do this thing, and you're going to be rewarded and recognized on that basis. So in my view, that is incredibly important. And then the second element is you have to have a kind of playbook. You have to have an IKEA kit that somebody can put together. And the good news is other companies have had to do this around the world from scratch. And there's enough commonality between data protection legislation frameworks around the world. We can talk about the divergences later, but there's enough commonality that you can have an IKEA toolkit for privacy programs. And I think Nikhil circulated, the list that we put together in our group to try to help companies start to think about how to implement structurally, create a skeleton on which you can apply each of these requirements that will give you the functionality and the muscles to execute on what you must do. In terms of what's occupying the most time, in my world, it is training, and I'll tell you why. So training isn't just once per year doing a PowerPoint presentation for the entire staff and saying, what is privacy? What is personal data? We must all be very careful and very sensitive. Thank you very much. Please sign here saying you completed your training. Many companies do that, and it may be very useful to have a generic kind of a training. The training that I'm talking about is in the weeds with each department, figuring out how they can do the privacy work that they need to do. For example, in the context of privacy by design in our group, we decided we wanted to create a certification program for the engineers in the group to get certified in privacy by design so they can decide how privacy reviews and assessments will happen based on checklists, based on questionnaires, embedded into JIRA, embedded into the exact same processes that they're using for business operations. Now, that's an incredibly powerful methodology for embedding privacy across an organization. It allows you to have a small centralized team, but a distributed responsibility under the mandate of the CEO. So that's the model that we like very much, but it's very time consuming. Imagine the thousands of troops. This is like a military campaign. You've got leaders, but you need everyone on the ground to be doing their bit. Otherwise, you're going to have gaps, something's going to fall through the cracks, and then you're going to have your privacy incident. So we invest tons of time on training, and that training is bespoke to the role and the function of the department and the element of the privacy program that they're helping to carry out.
Hey, Idris is going to come in, but I just feels this is like this, big outsourcing push. First, the regulator outsources it to the DPO, and the DPO is now outsourcing it to the engineers. So everyone's pushing it down the line. But you're right. I think that's the only way in which you can solve something at this scale. Idris.
That makes all sense, and actually, maybe that's kind of a little bit in line with what I was going to say, which is. I fully agree with what Justin and Shini said. Just adding one thing, which may depend on the company, but one thing that I did was in my team, I have privacy consuls, attorneys, essentially, and I have what I call privacy program managers, which are basically project managers, essentially, that take projects and make sure that they can go through the finish line, essentially. And so because we are kind of an internal service center where we're providing advice to the company, we're building policies and then providing advice, we also need to make sure that those things are implemented. And for this, like my privacy program managers, they basically go to all of our teams. We have many different brands with completely different teams, different technical infrastructures and so forth. And they help them understand where this comes from, why, what do they think about it? Do they need any variation? Why, like settling on those things and helping them understand what that requirement that we're, as something that we're asking them to do, what it means in terms of technical specifications, in terms of business, specifications, that sort of things. Like we have people literally dedicated to doing this, to rolling out essentially the advice and not just kind of, producing it. That's one of the things when it comes to like rolling out, and that applies to, right to be forgotten, but any project that you need to put in place, you need to design, okay, so what are we doing, right? What's the policy? And then you need to actually make it happen. And for this, you need to have people that just will be there, that will continue that work, that will push people until that project is actually done, right, in practice. And the second thing when it comes to what's keeping us the most most thing that we do is we're actually using a tool, like a project management tool within my team where like people literally say what they're doing, right? And so we actually have numbers on this. And so always, every quarter, the one that comes on top is product reviews. So that's very practical, right? Like I'm really talking practically. It's, oh, well, that team has a new project. They feel like they're going to implement that feature into Tinder, let's say. And so, okay, so what are we going to do about it? Why do you guys want to do this? What are the privacy impacts? Let's work through and brainstorm all of us around how we can enable you guys to put this, tool in place in a privacy aware and like conscious way, essentially. That's always number one in terms of how long. And I will say, when it comes to what you were saying, Rahul, like maybe the less interesting one, I love that that's the first one. That's by far the most interesting one in my mind. And it's great to just be sitting in those rooms with like, 10 engineers explaining to you how something works. And then we're finding solutions together. That's like massively interesting. And it's great that it would be the first one. And the second one, that is kind of like, without transition, unfortunately, because it's kind of the other side of the spectrum, but it is the second one always in terms of number, at least it's customer care. Because for two reasons, right? One, because you're talking many people, right? So it is bound to happen again. And because it's customers, and ultimately it's the people whose data you process. And so if you want to really do things well, it's there, right? Because ultimately people, there's a lot of things that are a little bit abstract, right? To like data subjects, or principles, in their like the Indian bill. Like the people whose data we process, a lot of the GDPR requirements around like accountability and privacy by design, that sort of things, it's very abstract to them. what matters to them. Like ultimately, it is important, like we are doing it, but what matters to them, like directly, is, okay, I want to know what data you have about me. I want you to delete my data. This is stuff that really matters to them. And so this is the thing you want to put like a lot of effort in to make sure that people are satisfied with the way that you're handling this. And the second reason is obviously also it drives a lot of company exposure. If you're answering someone something in a way that someone will feel like is inappropriate, that person will go also to regulator, and without even knowing it, they will misrepresent what you are saying, right? Maybe you're saying, look, I cannot send you someone else's data, right? It cannot happen, or I wasn't able to authenticate you, so at some point I cannot provide you your data. You need to be clear enough in your answers so that the person doesn't go to regulator and in a way, without meaning it, misrepresenting the fact that you just didn't accommodate their request in practice.
Nikhil once again has his hand up, but I just wanted to pick up some, you know that you're striking a chord when one of the questions in the chat is what sort of rough percentage of organizational budget should be set aside for the CPO CDO team? It's now getting real, and Narika asked this question. I don't, Justin, maybe you have a sense because you invest in a lot of companies that do in the BRICS region. That might be a good way to think about it. I think maybe even Srini, from the perspective of those sorts of companies, if there's a sense of what's the rough percentage without revealing any internal company secrets, what should we be thinking about? How important is this for a company? And maybe, Justin, you can start with some of those countries that are in India's shoes, like, as you said, Brazil, which is sort of only ramping it up. And so it's not yet at the scale of Europe.
The way that I think about talking about budgeting is in categories. So let's talk about the first category, which is human resources category. Usually, there will be a minimum of one person that must be hired. Right? We'll call them the chief privacy officer, the privacy leader, the data protection officer. In most of the jurisdictions that are similarly situated, the cost or salary cost for that individual is roughly similar to mid-level lawyer salary. So because so many jurisdictions tend to look to lawyers as a starting point, that is typically a benchmark. Now, because this is a specialized skill set, it would be on the higher end of that lawyer benchmark. And a very common first hire would typically be somebody who is maybe a senior associate level, I would say. So that gives you a sense of HR. And then, of course, if the company is very generous, if they give them additional heads, it would go down from there. But I would say that that's a good benchmark from a human resources perspective for anyone that's in finance now. The other items that I have in budgets that are sort of generic budgets, one of them has to do with the cost of automation. And I think this is an interesting part of the conversation because IT departments have lots of experience with procurement of tools and vendor tools and so forth. There are numerous privacy enhancing technologies that may be useful to integrate within an organization and an organization's way of doing those things. Those come with a price. There are a lot of third-party vendors now in the privacy and security space. You can benchmark your costs against licenses you may hold with security vendors. But in general, typically it is an annual license that's, for example, a company like OneTrust, which is one of the companies that we work with. They tend to sell different modules, and those modules correspond to different deliverables under the data protection law. So there could be an automated way of dealing with and tracking all of these hundreds of thousands of requests from the public. There could be a consent management tool. There could be a data mapping tool, a wide range. So we must have the list of activities that are generated by the Indian privacy legislation. And then we can create a provisional budget by assuming that we're not going to hire thousands of humans to do all of these things. And we're going to be interested in a certain degree of automation, if we can get it, for a reasonable price. And that's a way of creating a budget for each of those items. The alternative being human or manual intervention, and then we're back to the cost of HR and headcount. And then the third category, in my case, I mentioned training. I do think it's very useful to budget and allocate budget for training because it's time consuming and you have to reach so many diverse audiences. And so it's useful to have a training budget. Sometimes training budgets are spent on automated privacy trainings, which you can rent from another organization. You could create your own, which is the cost of creating and producing original video content. Or you could just pay the travel expenses of your amazing privacy leader and send them all over to all the jurisdictions and territories of India on the ground, if it is safe to do so, with masks, appropriately vaccinated, etc. But if you think about building a budget sort of in those blocks, you've got a good start.
I was just going to say, in that list of things, there's also some very good external counsel who would be very happy to travel and do these trainings if you so choose. Srini.
Yeah, just to add what Justin said, I think he since touched upon the tools and technologies. I'll focus on the people side. So there's no straightforward answer in terms of how many people you would require, but it all depends on a couple of important factors, and those factors would be the nature of the business. Are you consumer facing, in which case you are likely to get a huge amount of DSRs and breaches, which would put your operational department in vigil always, right? So you have to man that properly. If you are one who is constantly changing, embracing change, adding more technologies, more tools, then the privacy impact assessment is a big focus area. So the DPO's job gets more attention towards doing assessments, risk assessments, etc. If you're expanding locations, taking up newer locations, and the more jurisdictions you have, the complexity increases. But every other time, there is a change, and that's what our situation is, because we have so many jurisdictions. Fourthly, it will also depend on the way you have decided to create the organization structure. There are some some organizations which decide to decentralize it and not keep it with centralized DPO, and they would prefer that each business unit, let's say, may have a privacy engineer or privacy champion, stuff like that, where they will take the engineering aspects and embed privacy into the design in a different way. In one technology, it'll be different. In another domain, it'll be completely different. So they specialize, and overall the DPO oversees to see that they are aligned, they are trained, they're equipped, enabled. Other option could be that you keep everything in a centralized way. So it all depends on how you do. It may be sometimes for profit sharing, for them to realize the cost, it is better to keep under the unit, because then they will be okay to pay it. Management may not agree to give you all the money to you, but they will be okay if each business unit says, hey, I have to comply to HIPAA, so I need so many people. So I think it all depends on all these factors, in my view.
Well, just one thing that I would add, which is sort of a hidden cost, even though a number of companies are actually tracking it still, is the bandwidth that this takes versus other business initiatives, and that's something that on a day-to-day basis, like, those are discussions and negotiations with the companies always. But just setting people's expectation as a new law comes up and you need to adapt your product and services to those requirements, it takes time for teams to actually put them in place. It can be in engineer, in my world, like a medium tech company, engineers' time is the most valuable commodity we have internally. And so if you want to fight for that time, it's going to take away from product initiative, from business initiative that would have made us, make more money. And it is what it is. So it also costs you money in that regard.
Yeah, no, super important. I think we are underestimating the amount of re-engineering. Yes, Nikhil, you've been very patient.
I have a slightly philosophical question to ask. And one of the themes for our discussion has been the impact of privacy legislation on the openness and the global nature of the internet. And I'm just wondering that, let's say 5, 6, 10 years down the line, if we have 100 jurisdictions with 100 privacy laws, I'm just curious about what everyone thinks about how products that are global products will be impacted. What kind of capacities would organizations need to have? And to that extent, is this the beginning of the end for global products? Just thinking about this.
Yeah, I can answer that, Rahul, if you're okay.
Please. It's a neat reminder that we did get into a rabbit hole, and we've got 2 more segments to cover, but we've got only 5 minutes left.
We can go on if you want.
Yeah. So you're right, Nikhil. Today, when the number of jurisdictions are diverse, we will be compelled to adhere to all these areas. So fortunately, I think one of our co-panelists covered that the regulations in each jurisdiction is not completely different. In fact, they're very, very similar. The difference is marginal. So the issue is not so much serious problem. The only problem is when they're conflicting. For instance, localization laws, data disclosure laws, surveillance laws, like we saw in Schrems too. So these, if you leave aside these, bulk of it is similar. And my experience has been, I always recommend that we should go for a standard, such as, for instance, ISO standard. Example is ISO 27701, which got published in 2019. So such standard, if you follow, the standard doesn't give you liberty to say, okay, I complied to this and therefore I don't need to comply to GDPR, but it is mapped to GDPR principles, and therefore you are more likely to be doing all that is required in to be able to comply to various jurisdictions. And add over that the delta that needs to be done in Japan versus Hong Kong versus Mexico, and keep the baseline measures standard, and so scalability becomes easy. Secondly, it also brings in a seriousness of rigor, which is missing, because traditionally we say GDPR compliance has to be done, or LGPD Brazil has come up, we call a consultant, spend lots of thousands of dollars, and then get compliance done, and then go back to our regular business, saying that business is a priority. Now, hey guys, we got compliant to LGPD. The way it has to happen, the standards, there is a rigor. There's an external auditing body which comes every year, every 6 months for surveillance. So that ensures the sustainability of compliance. We are all used to an examination, which is missing in a regulatory compliance scenario. One, you keep quiet, you say that I'm compliant, 5 years later you are put a enforcement comes on you. So to avoid that, I would recommend that we should all go for some standard. Like Infosys went for 27701 last year. We became the world's first company to get that certified. But you can choose some of the standard. There are like BS 10012 is there in UK. India, we have one standard called IS 17428. So my recommendation is that's the best way to handle complexity of regulations. Over to Rahul.
No, I actually wanted to just underscore what Nikhil said and ask the question again, because I think as much as everything is similar, if every country, and if you've got 100 countries that you're in, is different in one way, you have to build your product 100 different ways, regardless of the fact that 90% is the same. Because of the differences, you'll have to build, and that's more to I guess Justin, some of the companies that that Naspers has invested in that are looking at more than one jurisdiction as a market, and even to you, Idris, your product is. Some products have the luxury of being able to have a different version for every country that they get into. I would say some of the more online to offline or offline to online kind of models where you have to be local because that's sort of the nature of the local requirements. But many of the businesses that are almost 90% in the virtual domain, it is actually a big problem because there is a benefit of giving customers a unified experience regardless of which country they go. And how do you address that if in fact we are going to be fragmented in the way we are, even if it is only on the margin?
We do. So, at Naspers and at Proces, which is the Dutch headquarters of our internet investment arm, we talk about this a lot, this tension between global and local, right? And the purity of each end of that spectrum is something that I think we can all get our heads around. But the reality lives in the complexity in the middle. It's the third way. It's the third thing, which is that indeed, as Srini was saying, 90% of what we around the world as planetary citizens expect of privacy likely overlaps. And to that extent, there is value in convergence and interoperability and reducing barriers and incompatibility between nations, particularly between major trading partners. But even if you build something that is global, that very same product or feature may be experienced differently by different populations. There's an element of culture living inside of this privacy problem that we shouldn't disrespect or disregard. And so just because something is compliant in lots of jurisdictions doesn't always mean it's equally liked. Citizens in Mexico may be perfectly comfortable with a flashlight app feature, and citizens in Canada, just staying in the Americas, might be very, very uncomfortable with the idea of tracking In India, there's going to be things that Indian citizens are very sensitive about that certain other jurisdictions are sort of like, meh, we don't really care about that thing, we care about something else. And there may be a relaxed feeling in India about a topic that's very, very hot in the United States or in Europe. And so if we anticipate the inevitability of those local expectations and local preferences, I think that is different than, you know, purely localized legislation or purely localized products of data centers, but having enough of a control over that gas pedal and the brakes that we're constantly able to adjust and accommodate maybe a range of scenarios is probably what reality looks like in the future multinational technology world.
Idris, any comments on that?
Yeah, just a very quick thought. So there is definitely a variation, and some companies are well suited to addressing those variations and some are not. Like, we're lucky that anyway, like, we have a service like social discovery that is very culturally impacted. So we are used to going in there and adapting our product, you know, to the market. So it's not like the first time, you know, privacy isn't the first time we're doing it. But I will say there is also a point in, you know, to Justin's point when he's saying like adapting like a range of things, having a product that caters like a range of things, and also like a big benefit. You can go in there and try to be even more specific, but the big benefit is also addressing the unknown, right? Because not every company has, you know, like, you know, 45 lawyers looking into all local laws of, you know, 250 countries, right? That bar embargo, right? And so if you have a system that actually addresses, like, has a good privacy baseline for everyone, and you're just applying this at scale, and then you're working with the variations, you know, from there, you're also addressing the unknown, all of those laws that you actually do not even know. Because privacy, you know, we're always talking about those countries where new privacy laws are being passed. But even when there's no privacy law, I mean, India, you know, we know this, it's a constitutional right, as we know now, right? And it's the case in most countries. You will have some, you know, some constitutional right or concept that will actually say that people have a right to their privacy. So by having that baseline and applying it at scale and starting from there, you're addressing your unknown, which also from an exposure kind of with my attorney's hat, you know, perspective makes a lot of sense for the company.
You know, we're at time, but I couldn't call this to close without asking each of you something about the forthcoming privacy law in India. What are your, you know, what are your expectations? What are the things you're afraid of? Or actually, more importantly, what, you know, just learning from your experiences. One, you know, with implementing GDPR, which was virtually a new law, even though it was an existing framework. But also, you know, in either when you've rolled out your services to a new jurisdiction, or when there's been a change in a new jurisdiction, what are the lessons that we in India can learn? And you know, I think focus this on companies, because a lot of companies, we've already started getting questions from our clients saying, we need to start preparing. Can you start doing trainings? And hence the plug. And lots of other, you know, what are the first things we have to do? So it would really help to get from chief privacy officers what their view is in terms of the particular framework that India has come up with in the PDP bill. What do you think the lessons are that we can learn as we prepare to roll this out? And you know, I'm going to start with Justin and Idris, sort of the external perspective, though I know both of you are not necessarily external, and Srini, the internal perspective, though I know that all your experience is actually external. So good to flip the table for this. Either of you, Justin, Idris, whoever wants to go.
I'll just throw two on the table, and then I'll be eager to hear from others as well. I think the first lesson of Europe that is useful in the Indian context is that setting a standard for foreign countries that requires that foreign country to be essentially equivalent or substantially similar. You know, there's a range of language that's floated around the idea of adequacy. Having a very rigid set of criteria about what another country must look like in order to be eligible to partner or trade with India, in my view, is unhelpful. And we've seen in the European experience that a well-intentioned and thoughtful regime for international data transfers that depends on some very specific language, that the continent has been working with for a long time, has led to, as we heard in the previous panel, multiple court decisions invalidating what the political leadership and the government tried to put in place with their trading partners. And so I would just suggest that learning carry forward into India, recognizing that India also has a very powerful and thoughtful Supreme Court that will be interpreting language, and that the government itself will not have entire discretion to rewrite things, once those frameworks are put in place. So in the context of international data transfers, I think that there is a learning to maintain as much flexibility and avoid as much rigidity of language, so that the courts and the government don't constrain themselves in a way that perhaps wasn't intended. I think that's one lesson that India is very well placed to avoid a repeat of that type of trade barrier outcome that was an unintentional consequence. The second thing I would suggest, humbly, is that one of the values of having had the GDPR, and you started, Rahul, by saying, suggesting that it was going to be the template for the world. And we see all through South America and Africa and in many Asian countries, the copy. The value of that is it does actually facilitate benchmarking and the identification of those 90% overlaps that we were talking about, which helps with program implementation. If, and I know this is sort of an ongoing discussion, instead of treating topics like personal data, non-personal data, you mentioned all the European legislations, there's some exploration of whether it's feasible to combine them in one piece of legislation. I think one of the negatives to that approach would be that it risks overshadowing the pure benchmarking on personal data that India has already essentially done and prepared. So I wouldn't want it to be perceived as ambiguous or uncertain what the framework for personal data really is. And there's a benefit to having an independent personal data protection bill that's just about personal data. That doesn't foreclose regulation on other categories of data or other types of operations. But I think for benchmarking purposes internationally, there's value in parity. And so I'd suggest that as well.
Thanks. Idris, any comments?
I mean, very quickly, I think, first, I do believe that GDPR is a great piece of law. I will say, I think there's a lot of things, they could have done better and so on, but it put privacy on the map, on the entire world. And just for this, candidly, it's a great piece of legislation. It is somewhat flexible, even though sometimes people forget about it. It is a risk-based legislation. It's expressly telling you need to take into account risk. So risk exists everywhere. It is flexible, with concept like legitimate interest, which is kind of there in the PDP bill, but not really kind of at the level of GDPR. So that flexibility is really important. I would absolutely support this. I think the two main things that I would say in one sentence is just safety and competition, just making sure that GDPR was kind of done in the abstract, just privacy. And I think since then we saw all of the overlaps between privacy and safety. You want to keep people safe, and for you to be able to keep them safe, you need to process their data. And so there needs to be some appropriate exemptions and possibilities for you to process data to keep people safe on your platforms. And obviously social discovery us, that's important. And competition, we're seeing a lot of overlap, in terms of competition, with lots of discussions, the one, with gatekeepers in the mobile world, for instance, where privacy is absolutely one of the impacted field, that those anti-competitive behaviors do impact people's privacy. And I'm hopeful that new privacy law will take this into account more to try and address this.
Yeah.
Srini,
so
last word.
Sure. So I think in my view, it was a fabulous job done by the Justice Sri Krishna Committee and MIT together to bring out the DP bill. Of course, the versions are changing, so I would not know the latest that is available, but and what we hear about it. But what I see is it is imbibed all best practices from the world and adapted to our culture. It's very important to put our culture into that. But few areas, particularly, I was appreciating the sandbox, which was some of the countries like ICO, UK has implemented, whereby you allow innovation to come in a small isolated environment and then release it, and there are safeguards required for that. Some of the areas I think where I see possibility of improvement was consent. It was really confusing that we need to appreciate the meaning of consent, because consent is loosely used to even take acknowledgement of a privacy notice. So we should be very careful to see, like, consent has to be absolutely unbiased, between equal parties, revocable, given freely. I think some places the meaning that we use in consent and notice is thin line between that. I think I want to make sure that people understand when they put consent, with their overemphasis on consent. Second is about localization. There is data localization aspects coming into it, possibly, which I feel that it should be kept separate. If localization is for safety of people's data going out, we should take care of that. There has to be like equivalent like Europe, SCC, etc. But if it is about for some other reason, like, you want the government to access data, keep it here, those reasons has to be beyond the data protection law, and they can be. There is a necessity for us to promulgate such laws, but I want to make sure that it's not mixed with data privacy like in other jurisdictions. Thirdly, I see that I think Justin mentioned about it, non-PI and PI should not be combined. I hope it will not be, because non-PI, when it is PI, when it is converted for larger good into non-PI, definitely it should be done for the larger benefit of society. But a lot of safeguards are required, which the data privacy bill should mention about, such as de-identification techniques, pseudonymization, etc., which should be applied, and that a non-PI authority could be separate. Combining the two could be. And lastly, I want to say that too many provisions are there which are left to subsequent executive to come out with. A good number of provisions should be part of the enacted as law, and not left to subsequent executive authorities to make. Unlike GDPR, I see a good amount of provisions which are left to, they will be decided subsequently by executive, etc. It causes confusion to the industry, and DPOs puts burden on DPO. We don't know. Uncertainty always hangs on nothing. That's what I want to say.
Thanks so much, Srini, and thank you to everyone. Nikhil, I hate being late. I'm really sorry we're 10 minutes over. I'm particularly sorry because Justin is 10 minutes deprived from his sleep. He has the latest time in the time zones of all of us. But look, I really, we promised rabbit holes, and I think we went into rabbit holes. We covered all sorts of areas that I wasn't planning to cover, but I'm really glad that we did. And I think, at least of all the conversations that I've had, this is probably one of the most substantial ones, Nikhil, correct me if I'm wrong, that have actually gone into the nitty-gritties of what next. Because we've so far been talking about the law, we've been talking about the regulator, but really companies have to get to the point where they say, this is coming, these are the sorts of things we need to do. We've got to write up budgets. We've got to find people. We've got to, brief the CEO to say that this is a priority. I think these are easier said than done. And I think it's really important that we start doing this. So with that, I'm going to hand it over to Nikhil. Thank you, Idris, Justin, Srini. I thoroughly enjoyed myself. I hope you all did too. And it looks like all the participants have stayed all the way through till the end. So I hope they have as well.
Thanks, Rahul. Our objective with this discussion was exactly to go down this rabbit hole. We spoke with the DPCs earlier today about setting up a data protection commission and what are the first things that you would do when you set one up. And look, we have to focus on operationalization now. So thank you all for your inputs. This was an absolutely fantastic session. You could have gone another 20 minutes overtime and I wouldn't have minded, but I guess Justin needs to get some sleep probably. But thank you all for joining us. We've had 2 days of exceptional commentary. We'll be writing about these discussions on MediaNama. So please do watch out for our reporting later this week and through next week. We'll also be preparing a report, which we hope to share with the JPC in terms of the inputs, especially related to operationalization. We've covered a fair amount of ground over the last couple of days in terms of how data collection related to bodies ought to be regulated. We've looked at privacy regulations across the BRICS economies. We've understood the lives of a data protection commissioner and how a DPC can be more effective, how a DPC can be set up, or a DPA can be set up. we've also discussed what it takes and what's the granular process of enabling adequacy between jurisdictions. And lastly, we've learned from three of them what kind of a superhero a data protection commissioner or a data protection officer in a company needs to be. You can watch these sessions if you want to watch them again over the weekend on YouTube. And we'll also be splitting the conference into multiple sessions and also uploading each session. We'd like to thank Flipkart, Facebook, Internet Society, Mozilla, the Mobile Premier League, the Omidyar Network, Paytm, Star, and Xiaomi for the support for this discussion. We are thankful to our community partners, the Cyber BRICS project, the Center for Internet and Society, and the Center for Communications Governance at National Law University, Delhi, in terms of helping putting together this program. Thank you all. We hope to revisit this conference in about a year's time, and hopefully by then the data protection law in India would have passed. We would have had conversations on operationalizing, and maybe we can then do a review on how things are going, both in India and across the globe, because I think we will have to adapt, and the internet will have to adapt to changing privacy regulations and new regulations coming up. And I hope that this conference can be a place where we can all meet to reflect on what is going on and perhaps what ought to be done. Thank you all for a fantastic conference.